We think of war as noise, as fire and sirens and the crash of things falling. But most of the people who lived through the Second World War did not spend their time in the middle of that noise. They spent it waiting. For every single day of active combat during the Second World War, there were approximately 8 days of waiting. The war lasted roughly 2,074 days, from the German invasion of Poland all the way to the Japanese surrender. And through the vast majority of those days, the people living inside the war were not fighting. They were waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for the weather, waiting for supplies, waiting for news, waiting for the letter that hadn't come, waiting for the door to open, or for the radio to say something true. Today we move through a gentle journey through 101 facts about that waiting. Some of these facts may surprise you. The world outside is still. Your breathing is steady. Let yourself simply be here. Fact number 1. Before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the men who would make that crossing had already spent an average of nearly 3 years waiting, training and living in a kind of suspended readiness. The soldiers of the 1st Canadian Army had been in Britain since 1939 and 1940, some of them for almost 4 full years by the time D-Day finally arrived. They lived in camps and billets scattered across the English countryside, training over and over for an invasion that kept being planned, and then postponed, and then replanned, and then postponed again. Many of these men had volunteered expecting immediate action. Instead, they found themselves held inside a long, shapeless pause that military routine could organize but could not fill with real meaning. The training was rigorous, the discipline was genuine, but neither could replace the sense of purpose that actual engagement would have provided. Canadian veterans who later spoke about those years in Britain said, with remarkable consistency, that the waiting had been one of the most psychologically demanding periods of their entire wartime experience. Harder, some said, than the combat that eventually came after, because combat at least made it clear what was needed, while the waiting only offered one more day of uncertainty, and then another after that. Fact number 2. On the island of Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942, a young American Marine wrote in his diary that the worst part of the island was not the Japanese, not the heat, not the disease, and not the food. It was the silence between the attacks, the not knowing whether the next hour would bring something terrible or nothing at all. His words captured something that military psychologists had been searching for the right language to describe for decades. The particular kind of damage that comes not from danger itself, but from the sustained anticipation of danger that never quite resolves. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, and its rhythm of intense combat followed by long stretches of patrol and heat and stillness was repeated across dozens of Pacific Island battles that came after it. Veterans of those campaigns described the quiet periods not as rest, but as a different and sometimes more wearing kind of stress, one that operated quietly below the surface, gathering in the body without a name or a shape, surfacing later in ways that the medical understanding of the time was not well prepared to recognize or treat. Fact number 3. Between the evacuation of Dunkirk in June 1940 and the beginning of the North African campaign in October 1942, Britain existed in a kind of military suspension that lasted approximately 2.5 years. It was a time when the country was simultaneously bracing for an invasion that never came, planning offensives that could not yet be launched, and simply enduring a waiting that had no clear ending and no reliable map. Churchill's public speeches were remarkable in the way they constructed a sense of forward movement, words about fighting on beaches and in fields and in streets that gave civilians something to hold on to. But the quiet military reality was one of genuine limitation. Britain did not yet have the resources, the allies, or the logistical reach for the kind of action the speeches implied. The soldiers who trained on British hillsides and beaches during those years, rehearsing an invasion with no confirmed date and no confirmed destination, were living inside a particular kind of waiting, one that combined military structure with strategic uncertainty, organized but not yet purposeful, ready but not yet needed. Fact number 4. Letters traveled slowly during the war years, and the gap between writing and receiving, which could stretch across weeks or even months, depending on the theater and the reliability of the mail service, created a strange kind of time displacement in the correspondence between soldiers and the people they loved. A soldier writing a letter home in November was writing into a future he could not see. one in which she would read his words long after the moment that had prompted them had already passed. A wife reading a letter in December was reading words composed in a past that the war might have already changed beyond recognition, reassurances about safety that had been written before an engagement, expressions of hope about a situation that had since shifted entirely. The letters of the war years therefore operated in a permanent lag, a conversation conducted across a gap of time as much as distance, in which both people were always speaking to a version of the other that was already slightly in the past. And in the silence between letters, the waiting filled itself with the kind of patient, anxious, unresolvable uncertainty that was perhaps the most intimate form of the war's waiting, quiet and private and endless. Fact number 5. The Phony War, the 8-month stretch between Britain's declaration of war in September 1939 and the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940, was one of the largest and most consequential periods of collective waiting in the entire conflict. British and French civilians who had braced for immediate devastating air raids found instead a period of eerie normality. The evacuated children came home. The bombing didn't materialize. Life continued in a state of suspended anxiety that the absence of dramatic events made particularly difficult to hold on to. Politicians and newspapers coined the phrase phony war with a mixture of relief and mild mockery, but underneath the phrase was a real difficulty. The difficulty of maintaining wartime sacrifice and wartime resolve when the wartime events that were supposed to justify them simply hadn't arrived yet. The phony war ended with sudden and devastating force in May 1940, when the German offensive through the Ardennes swept away the careful positions that the Allies had spent 8 months preparing. The waiting, it turned out, had not been used as well as it might have been. The assumption that there was still more time had been a quietly dangerous illusion. Fact number 6. Submarines spent the great majority of their operational deployments not in the dramatic engagements that their histories tend to highlight, but in the long, silent, claustrophobic waiting that came before and after those engagements. Submerged in dark water, pressed in on all sides, the crews waited for the sound of propellers above them that might or might not be followed by the sound of depth charges falling. A typical U-boat patrol in the North Atlantic lasted between 4 and 8 weeks, and within that time, the ratio of action to waiting was heavily weighted toward the latter. Crew members who were not on watch occupied themselves as best they could in spaces so confined that personal privacy was essentially non-existent. The management of relationships within the crew became as operationally important as technical skill. The specific stress of submarine waiting, the silence, the darkness, the confinement, the knowledge that discovery would be followed almost immediately by attack, was something that training attempted to prepare men for, but that the reality of extended patrols consistently exceeded. Veterans of submarine service across multiple navies described the waiting between engagements as the aspect of their service that left the deepest and most lasting marks, deeper in many cases than the engagements themselves. Fact number 7. Military hospitals behind the front lines developed their own particular culture of waiting, one that was distinct from both the active waiting of soldiers preparing for combat and the more passive waiting of civilians at home. Wounded soldiers who had survived the immediate emergency of their injuries entered a prolonged medical suspension, waiting for operations, waiting for wounds to heal, waiting to learn whether they would return to their unit or be discharged, waiting to discover what their body would and would not be able to do in the life that came after. This waiting was experienced against a constant background of pain, boredom, and an enforced passivity that many active soldiers found profoundly difficult to endure. Military hospitals attempted to address this through occupational therapy, educational programs, and organized recreation, activities that were simultaneously therapeutic and a practical response to the challenge of managing large numbers of physically incapacitated men who were in most cases mentally fully present and therefore in real danger of what enforced idleness under conditions of uncertainty and pain tends to produce. The waiting of the military hospital was one of the less visible but genuinely significant forms of wartime waiting, affecting hundreds of thousands of men, whose recovery was shaped as much by the psychological management of that waiting period as by the medical treatment of their physical injuries. Fact number 8. Weather governed the timing of military operations in every theater of the Second World War to a degree that modern observers sometimes find difficult to fully appreciate. The D-Day landings were postponed by 24 hours because of conditions that made the original date impossible, and the decision to proceed on June the 6th, rather than waiting for the next available window, which would have been weeks away, was made by Eisenhower on the basis of a weather forecast that was itself uncertain, and that proved accurate by the narrowest of margins. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 began under cloud cover that grounded Allied air support, handing the German forces an advantage that the weather itself had provided. It ended when the clouds finally broke in late December and Allied air power could reach German supply lines again. The waiting that weather imposed on military operations was a waiting over which no human agency had any control at all, and the frustration it produced in commanders who had their forces ready, their plans in place, their intelligence current, but who simply could not move because of wind or rain or fog or cloud, is one of the most consistently described forms of waiting in the memoirs and diaries of the war's senior leaders. Fact number 9. Prisoners of war experienced the war's waiting in what was perhaps its most extreme and most complete form. A waiting that was not simply a pause between active engagements, but the entire structure of daily life. For months or years at a time, men captured early in the war, in the fall of France in 1940, in the North African campaigns of 1941 and 42, in the Pacific in the same period, faced the prospect of waiting out a war whose duration they could not know and whose outcome they could not influence from behind wire. The psychological management of that waiting was the central challenge of prisoner of war existence, and the strategies that prisoners developed in response, the elaborate educational programs in the Colditz camps, the tunnel digging of Stalag Luft III, the theatrical productions and sporting competitions organized across camps in Europe and Asia, were all, in their different ways, responses to the same fundamental problem. Not simply boredom, though boredom was real and corrosive enough, but the deeper difficulty of maintaining a sense of agency, of purpose, of self, in circumstances that had removed almost every external source of meaning and replaced it with an indefinite and uncontrollable waiting that the prisoner's own choices could shape only at the very edges. Fact number 10. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, conducted by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces from bases in Britain throughout the war, imposed on its aircrew a specific and intensely demanding form of waiting, the waiting between missions, shaped by the knowledge of the losses each mission produced, and by the statistical reality that completing a full tour of duty was, for a significant period of the campaign, a mathematical improbability. RAF Bomber Command aircrew in the early years of the campaign faced loss rates that made completing a full tour of 30 operations statistically unlikely for a crew who began flying in 1941 or 42. The waiting between missions, the days and nights in the airfield's living quarters, the interrupted sleep, the awareness of the empty beds left by crews who had not returned, created a psychological environment of extraordinary intensity. Some commanders understood the importance of keeping their crews occupied and purposeful during the waiting periods between operations. Others relied on professional discipline alone, without recognizing that what the waiting was quietly producing, a specific and cumulative form of psychological damage, was something that discipline by itself could not address. Fact number 11. Civilian populations in Britain who had lived through the most intense period of the Blitz in the autumn of 1940 found themselves, by the spring of 1941, in a strange new kind of waiting. The raids had become less frequent and less severe, but they had not entirely stopped. The waiting of the post-Blitz period was different from any other phase of the civilian experience. It was the waiting of people who had been through something enormous and who could not be certain it was entirely over, who could not fully relax because another warning might come, but who also could not sustain indefinitely the sharp alertness that the worst raid periods had demanded. This intermediate state, neither the full emergency of the Blitz nor the relative safety of the later war years, produced a particular kind of civilian exhaustion that was less visible than the acute stress of the raids themselves, but that accumulated quietly over months of uncertain waiting in ways that the medical services were only beginning to recognize. People described a flatness, a difficulty with ordinary pleasures, a persistent low-level anxiety that the absence of immediate crisis made, if anything, harder to manage, because without the specific immediate thing to respond to, the body stayed activated with nothing to activate it toward. Fact number 12. Resistance fighters in occupied Europe spent the majority of their operational lives in a state of waiting that was qualitatively different from military waiting in ways that made its psychological demands uniquely severe. A soldier waiting for combat did so within an institutional framework, one that provided routine, structure, comradeship, and a professional identity that the waiting period maintained even in the absence of active engagement. A resistance fighter waiting for an operation did so while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of an ordinary civilian life, going to work, shopping, keeping up social relationships in a context where the waiting was hidden, where the sense of shared purpose could not be openly expressed, and where the institutional frameworks that support military waiting were entirely absent. The specific loneliness of resistance waiting, the inability to speak openly about what you were doing and why, the maintenance of a public persona entirely at odds with your private reality, the management of fear without the collective acknowledgement of fear that a military unit provides, was one of the most psychologically demanding features of underground work, and the post-war accounts of resistance veterans return to it with a consistency that speaks to how deeply it had marked them. Fact number 13. Naval vessels on convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic spent weeks at sea in conditions that combined physical discomfort, constant vigilance, and the specific pressure of waiting for an attack that might come at any moment, or might not come at all during an entire crossing. The men on watch on the bridge of a convoy escort destroyer were required to maintain a level of visual and auditory alertness, scanning the horizon, listening for torpedo propellers, watching for the sudden column of water that marked a hit on one of the merchant vessels they were protecting, but could not be indefinitely sustained without degradation. Watch rotations were designed to manage this, but the knowledge that relaxing full alertness even briefly could cost lives gave the waiting a particular intensity that interrupted sleep schedules alone could not address. The North Atlantic convoy route, across which approximately 3,000 merchant vessels were sunk during the war, was one of the most consistently demanding environments of sustained vigilant waiting the entire conflict produced, a theater in which the potential for sudden catastrophic action was always genuinely present, and in which the management of readiness across the long hours between attacks was as important an operational challenge as the management of the attacks themselves. Fact number 14. Intelligence analysts who worked in the code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park and in the American equivalents spent their working lives in a form of waiting that was intellectual rather than physical. The waiting for a pattern to emerge from noise, for a cipher to yield its meaning, for the specific combination of insight and data to produce the breakthrough that their work was organized around achieving. Most of their time was spent in the careful, patient, unglamorous accumulation of partial information and the testing of hypotheses that mostly did not work out. The people who worked at Bletchley Park described their work with a consistent emphasis on its routine and repetitive character. The long hours of scanning intercepted traffic for the specific features that might indicate a break in a cipher, the disciplined management of the frustration of failed approaches, the maintenance of analytical concentration across working sessions that produced, most of the time, no result at all. The cultural memory of intelligence work tends to emphasize the breakthrough moments, but the vast waiting that surrounded those moments remains largely invisible, because waiting that produces no result leaves no dramatic story to tell. Fact number 15. Medical research teams working on wartime problems, the development of penicillin for mass production, effective treatments for malaria and other tropical diseases, surgical techniques for blast and burn injuries, worked within a scientific waiting shaped by the specific urgency of the wartime context. The development of penicillin from Alexander Fleming's 1928 discovery to mass production capability involved more than a decade of waiting for the funding, the personnel, and the technical capacity to transform a laboratory observation into a clinical treatment available in quantities that could make a meaningful difference. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, who did the essential developmental work in Oxford in the early 1940s, worked against a background of wartime urgency that compressed research timelines normally measured in decades into years, accepting levels of experimental risk that peacetime medical ethics would not have permitted. Knowing that the alternative, waiting for complete safety data while soldiers died of infections penicillin could cure, was ethically worse than moving forward with incomplete information. The waiting of wartime medical research was therefore not simply a feature of the scientific process, It was a moral dimension of decisions about how much certainty was enough before action became justified. Fact number 16. Throughout the long months of the Italian campaign, which lasted from the Allied landing in Sicily in July 1943 to the German surrender in Italy in May 1945, a period of nearly 2 years, soldiers on both sides endured a form of waiting defined by the specific geography of the Italian peninsula. The mountainous terrain of central Italy, crossed by a series of rivers running east to west, created natural defensive lines that the German forces exploited with considerable skill, turning the Allied advance into a grinding succession of battles separated by periods of waiting for the next assault, waiting for reinforcements, waiting for artillery preparation before the next river crossing. Soldiers who fought the Italian campaign described it, consistently and across multiple national contingents, as the most physically and psychologically exhausting experience of the entire war, not because any single engagement was the most intense they had faced, but because the combination of difficult terrain, persistent bad weather, determined German defense, and the relentless rhythm of assault, consolidation, and waiting for the next assault, sustained across nearly 2 years, produced a cumulative exhaustion that the individual battles alone did not explain. The Italian campaign was in a very real sense a campaign defined by its waiting as much as by its fighting. Fact number 17. Diplomatic negotiations that preceded and accompanied military operations during the war created their own specific form of waiting. The waiting of governments and commanders for political decisions whose outcomes would determine the strategic options available to them, and whose timing was governed by the calculations of political actors operating on timescales that bore little relationship to military urgency. The months of negotiation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union about the timing and location of the Second Front, the Allied landing in Western Europe that the Soviet Union had been demanding since 1941, were experienced very differently by each party. For Stalin, whose country was absorbing the full weight of the German military effort while the Western Allies delayed, the waiting was politically infuriating and militarily catastrophic in its cost. For Churchill, who held genuine strategic concerns about premature cross-channel operations, it was a necessary prudence. For Roosevelt, managing the political dynamics between his two major allies while simultaneously directing a Pacific war, it was a complex balancing act. The diplomatic waiting of the war's major decision-makers was therefore not a single experience but a convergence of multiple different waitings, each shaped by a different strategic situation, a different set of domestic pressures, and a different personality, all of which had eventually to resolve into a single agreed timeline that none of the parties had gotten exactly what they wanted from. Fact number 18. Desert warfare in North Africa imposed a specific quality of waiting on the soldiers who conducted it, shaped by the landscape's particular combination of vast emptiness, extreme temperature, and the almost complete absence of physical cover. Men waiting in the western desert waited in a place that offered almost no shade, no concealment, and no visual distinction between the horizon at dawn and the horizon at dusk, an environment whose monotony was both physical and psychological, and that provided none of the small variations of landscape and ecology that soldiers in other theaters used as quiet anchors for the days passing. The heat that made daytime operations extremely difficult forced much of the campaign's activity into hours of darkness, giving the desert war a rhythm of nocturnal movement and daytime stillness that shaped the experience of waiting in ways specific to the theater. Men who lay in slit trenches through the heat of the day, waiting for the temperature to drop enough for movement to be possible, described the quality of desert waiting: the sweat, the flies, the glare, the absolute absence of anything that changed, with an expressiveness that spoke to how completely the environment had shaped the texture of their experience. The desert was not simply a place where the war happened, it was a condition that the war created in the people who waited inside it. Fact number 19. Factory workers in the armaments industries of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union experienced a form of wartime waiting that was entirely different from military waiting, but no less psychologically demanding in its own way. The production line worker assembling aircraft components or filling artillery shells was not waiting for an enemy assault or for orders from a distant headquarters. They were waiting, in a more diffuse and less immediately identifiable sense, for the war to end, performing the same tasks day after day, week after week, knowing that each component contributed to an outcome that might still be years away, and that their individual contribution, however conscientiously made, was so small a part of so vast an effort that its specific connection to any outcome was impossible to trace. The management of this motivational challenge, the maintenance of productive effort and quality standards across years of repetitive industrial labor in an environment of wartime pressure and civilian hardship, was one of the primary challenges of wartime industrial management. The workers who sustained that effort through the long middle years, when the outcome was uncertain and the end not yet visible, were performing a form of sustained patience that the production totals of the armaments industries can measure but cannot fully describe. Fact number 20. The island of Malta endured one of the longest sustained periods of siege waiting experienced by any civilian population in the entire war. A siege that lasted from June 1940, when Italy entered the war and began bombing the island, to November 1942, when the Allied victory at El Alamein and the success of a resupply convoy finally broke the worst of the blockade. For 2.5 years, the Maltese civilian population and the military garrison defending them lived in a sustained state of siege that combined regular bombing with severe food and fuel shortages that brought the island to the edge of starvation in the summer of 1942. The weighting of the Maltese siege was unique in the particular combination of pressures it held: the weighting of a population under active attack, interleaved with the weighting of a population genuinely running out of food, whose relief depended entirely on naval operations in the Mediterranean over which they had no influence and only fragmentary information. The collective resilience demonstrated by the Maltese people during this period was recognized by the award of the George Cross to the island as a whole in April 1942, the only time in history the George Cross has been awarded to an entire population. An acknowledgement, however partial, of the specific and extraordinary demands that the weighting of the siege had placed on every man, woman and child living through it. Fact number 21. Paratroopers who boarded their aircraft on the night of June 5, 1944, for the airborne operations preceding the D-Day landings, carried with them a form of pre-combat weighting that veterans of airborne operations consistently described as among the most psychologically intense experiences of their entire service. The waiting inside the aircraft, hours of flight over the channel in darkness, engines too loud for conversation, equipment heavy and uncomfortable, the knowledge of what was waiting on the other side of the jump, had itself been preceded by days of confinement in sealed marshalling areas, where the men had been fully briefed on their objectives but were not permitted to leave or communicate with anyone outside. That confinement had been preceded by months of training for an operation whose date had been repeatedly postponed. The layered quality of this waiting, months of general preparation, days of specific confinement, hours of airborne transit, produced a psychological compression that veterans described as both unbearable and in a strange way clarifying. By the time the red light turned green and the jump master gave the order, many men reported feeling not the terror they had anticipated, but a profound and almost physical relief. The relief at last of action replacing the waiting that had in its own quiet way been harder to endure. Fact number 22. Somewhere in the jungles of Burma in 1943, a British soldier wrote in his diary that time had ceased to have any normal meaning. Days passed, he wrote, but they did not accumulate into anything he could recognize as progress. The jungle was the same every morning, the heat was the same, the insects were the same, the orders were the same orders given the day before, and the day before that, and he had stopped trying to count how many days it had been since anything had actually changed. His diary entry, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archive, captures something about the Burma campaign that its military histories sometimes fail to fully convey: the specific quality of jungle waiting, in which the physical environment itself seemed to resist the passage of time, and in which the absence of visible change in the landscape made the absence of visible progress in the campaign feel permanent rather than temporary. The Burma campaign involved some of the most sustained and difficult fighting of the entire war, but it also involved some of the longest and most grinding periods of stillness, waiting in conditions of tropical heat, disease, and isolation that stripped away almost every dimension of ordinary human environment and replaced it with a jungle uniformity that swallowed time and returned nothing visible in exchange. Fact number 23. Radar operators at early warning stations along the British coastlines spent their operational hours in a state of concentrated waiting that was both technically demanding and psychologically exhausting in ways that the relatively glamorous public image of radar technology did nothing to reflect. The work of a radar operator was the work of sustained attention directed at a screen that mostly showed nothing, the careful maintenance of alertness across hours of watching for the specific patterns that indicated incoming aircraft, knowing that a momentary lapse of attention at the wrong moment could cost the warning time that fighters needed to intercept a raid before it reached its target. The chain home radar network that provided Britain's early warning capability during the Battle of Britain was operated almost entirely by Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel, whose reliability and concentration under the specific psychological demands of this kind of vigilant waiting was recognized by RAF commanders who worked with them as genuinely exceptional. The specific psychological skill required for sustained vigilant waiting, maintaining genuine alertness across long periods of apparent inactivity, resisting the pull toward relaxation that the absence of immediate events naturally encourages, staying genuinely ready for the signal that might come in the next second or might not come for another 4 hours, was one of the less visible but genuinely important human contributions to the defense of Britain during the war's most critical period. Fact number 24. The soldiers of the Red Army who fought the Battle of Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943 endured a form of waiting that was embedded within combat itself, the waiting of men who held a narrow strip of the city's riverbank, sometimes measuring their territorial control in tens of meters, waiting for the assault that experience told them was coming but that the rubble and the darkness and the noise made impossible to predict with any precision. The specific character of Stalingrad waiting was shaped by the city's transformation into a landscape of destroyed buildings that provided cover for both sides at ranges of sometimes less than 50 meters, a proximity that made the waiting between assaults a direct and constant physical confrontation with the possibility of death that could arrive at any moment and from any direction. Soviet soldiers defending the riverbank described a relationship with time that was distorted by the intensity of the environment. Hours felt like days, and days felt like hours, and the passage of time was measured not by clocks or by light, but by the rhythm of assault and consolidation that governed life at the river's edge. The waiting of Stalingrad was not a pause between events. It was itself an event, a sustained and grinding psychological test that the men who endured it were changed by in ways that the eventual Soviet victory did not and could not undo. Fact number 25. Nurses working in field hospitals close to the front lines experienced a form of waiting that oscillated between extreme busyness and extreme idleness in ways that were psychologically difficult to manage from either end. During major offensives, field hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties arriving faster than they could be treated, and medical staff worked continuously for days at a time in conditions of physical and emotional exhaustion that pushed the limits of human endurance. Between offensives, the same hospitals might sit almost empty. Beds cleared, operating theaters quiet, staff waiting in a silence that was simultaneously a relief and a source of its own particular stress. The anticipatory waiting between major casualty events was shaped by the specific knowledge of what the next offensive would bring, a clinical and precise knowledge that the nurses had gained from previous experience. They knew what blast injuries looked like. They knew what the operating theater would look like in the middle of the night when a large-scale assault had begun. This specific foreknowledge gave their waiting a quality entirely different from the waiting of people who did not know what they were waiting for. It was the waiting of people who knew exactly what was coming, who could not prevent it, and who had to hold their professional readiness and their emotional equilibrium steady through the days of quiet that came before. Fact number 26. Carrier pigeons used for military communications during the war spent the majority of their operational lives in a form of waiting that, while obviously not psychologically experienced in the human sense, illustrates something important about the logistical waiting the war imposed at every level of its operation. Military pigeon services maintained lofts of trained birds at forward positions across multiple theaters, and the management of these birds, their feeding, their conditioning, their deployment in weather conditions that affected their navigational reliability, was a genuine operational planning challenge that the military's communications sections took seriously. The human handlers who managed military pigeon lofts occupied a specific waiting role within the military logistics system, maintaining a communications capability that might be called upon at any moment or might sit unused for weeks, in a context where the reliability of that capability depended entirely on the quality of the care conducted during the waiting periods. Cher-Ami, the American carrier pigeon that delivered a critical message during the First World War, had become a symbol of this kind of reliable waiting. Trained, maintained, ready, that the Second World War pigeon services were attempting to replicate at larger scale. The military pigeon was in its own modest way an illustration of a general truth, that the waiting periods between events were not empty time but preparation time, and that the quality of what eventually happened depended directly on how well the waiting had been used. Fact number 27. Throughout the long months of the Pacific Island hopping campaign, American and Japanese forces sometimes occupied opposite ends of the same island for extended periods, aware of each other's presence, conducting patrols that occasionally resulted in contact, but not yet engaged in the kind of major assault that would resolve the tactical situation. The waiting of these periods of close but not yet fully engaged opposition was experienced very differently by the two sides, in ways that reflected their respective strategic positions. American forces waiting to assault a Japanese-held position were waiting from a position of controlled patience. The resources to move were being assembled. The waiting was a deliberate accumulation of advantage before action. Japanese forces waiting to be assaulted were waiting with the knowledge that their position was essentially untenable in the long term, and that the assault, when it came, would be conducted by forces with overwhelming material superiority. The psychological experience of waiting for an assault you know is coming, that you cannot prevent, and that you expect to be ultimately overwhelming. This is fundamentally different from the experience of waiting to launch an assault whose outcome, while uncertain, is supported by genuine material strength. And that difference between the two kinds of waiting shaped the specific character of the Pacific Island battles in ways that the tactical histories of individual engagements do not always fully capture. Fact number 28. Senior Allied commanders in the months before D-Day carried a specific and isolating form of waiting, the waiting of people who had made the decisions, who knew the plan, and who could now only wait to discover whether those decisions had been correct. Eisenhower's handwritten note, prepared on the evening of June 5, 1944, accepting personal responsibility for the decision to proceed with the landings and acknowledging the possibility that the operation might fail, was written during a waiting period that can have few equivalents in the history of military command. The note was never released because it was not needed. The landing succeeded, but its existence speaks to the particular quality of the waiting that Supreme Command imposed. A field soldier waiting for combat was waiting for something over which he would eventually have some personal agency. His own courage, his own skill, his own decisions in the immediate moment. A supreme commander waiting for an operation of this scale had already made all the decisions available to him and was now in a position of radical passivity, watching and waiting and being entirely unable to influence what was happening through any personal action. The waiting of Supreme Command was in this sense the most complete and most isolating form of wartime waiting, the waiting of a person who had done everything that could be done and who now had nothing left to do but wait and discover whether it had been enough. Fact number 29. Civilian internees held by Japanese forces in camps across Southeast Asia and the Pacific experienced a form of waiting that combined the prisoner of war experience of indefinite confinement with the civilian experience of maintaining family and social structures under conditions of extreme deprivation. European, American and Australian civilians who had been living in Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and other territories overrun by Japanese forces in early 1942 were interned in camps where they would spend between 3 and 4 years waiting for a liberation that many of them did not survive to see. The specific character of civilian internment waiting was shaped by the presence of family units within the camps, parents and children, husbands and wives where both had been captured, that the prisoner of war experience did not replicate. Parents who were struggling to maintain their own physical and psychological health under conditions of severe food shortage, forced labor, and deliberate mistreatment were simultaneously trying to protect their children from the worst of the camp environment and to maintain some degree of normal family routine. The waiting of civilian internment was therefore experienced on multiple levels at once: personal survival, family maintenance, and the collective social management of indefinitely extended confinement in conditions that the people enduring them had never been prepared for and could not have imagined. Fact number 30. The development of the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project involved a scientific and engineering weighting of extraordinary intensity, a race against an uncertain German nuclear program conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy, at a pace that compressed decades of normal scientific development into 3 years of concentrated wartime effort. The scientists and engineers who worked at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and the other Manhattan Project sites were waiting, in a very real sense, to discover whether what they were attempting was actually possible, whether the theoretical physics that suggested a fission bomb could be built would prove out in the physical reality of actual engineering. The Trinity test of July 16, 1945, the first detonation of a nuclear device, ended a specific and terminal form of scientific waiting, with a result whose implications the scientists present understood immediately and completely. J. Robert Oppenheimer's later description of his thoughts at the moment of the Trinity explosion, drawing on the Bhagavad Gita's words about death becoming the destroyer of worlds, was not a dramatic flourish. It was an honest account of what it felt like to be the person standing at the end of a waiting that had changed everything. Fact number 31. Hospital ships crossing the Pacific and Atlantic between theaters of operation and home ports carried their patients through voyages that lasted days or weeks, and that imposed a specific form of waiting. The waiting of injured men who were no longer in the immediate danger of the front but who had not yet reached the safety of home, who did not yet know the full permanent effects of their injuries, and who were crossing a distance that was simultaneously physical and psychological. The specific character of hospital ship waiting was shaped by the ship's position between worlds, no longer in the war, not yet out of it, moving through an intermediate space that had its own routines and its own particular emotional atmosphere. Medical staff described the emotional complexity of their patients, men relieved to be alive and away from the front, simultaneously anxious about what they were returning to, uncertain about what their injuries meant for the future, many of them processing the experiences of combat in the first extended period of relative safety they had had since entering the war. The crossing provided time, enforced, unstructured time of a kind that the pace of active military service had never previously allowed. And what men did with that time, how they used the days of ocean crossing to begin to process what had happened to them, was one of the less visible but genuinely significant dimensions of the long transition from wartime to whatever came next. Fact number 32. Behind the front lines of every major military campaign, the logistical services that kept armies supplied with food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment spent the majority of their time in a form of operational waiting that the dramatic histories of military campaigns almost never describe. The supply sergeant in Normandy who managed the flow of ammunition from the beaches to the forward units was not fighting, but he was waiting. Waiting for delivery schedules subject to constant disruption, waiting for vehicles in maintenance, waiting for road conditions to permit movement, waiting for the tactical situation to stabilize sufficiently to allow the planning of supply runs that required at least a minimum of predictability. The logistical waiting of the Second World War was experienced by millions of military personnel across every theater, in roles essential to the outcome of the war but consistently and systematically underrepresented in the war's narratives. The men and women who drove trucks, managed depots, processed requisitions, maintained fuel pipelines, and coordinated the movement of supplies across distances measured in hundreds of miles were performing a form of sustained operational patience that the fighting at the sharp end of the military machine depended on entirely and acknowledged only occasionally. Their waiting was unglamorous, necessary, and endless, and its adequate management was as important to the outcome of specific operations as any decision made in any command tent. Fact number 33. Throughout the war, the development and production of new weapons systems involved their designers and manufacturers in a specific form of technical waiting. The waiting between the conception of a design and the moment when that design could be tested, refined, and eventually deployed in quantities sufficient to make a difference to the operational situation. The development of the Spitfire, the Sherman tank, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the T-34, and dozens of other weapons that shaped the war's outcome each involved years of design iteration, production delays, and the specific frustration of watching the enemy deploy capabilities that your own were intended to counter, before your own production lines could deliver in sufficient numbers. The engineers and production planners who managed these development waiting periods were making decisions about acceptable risk and adequate testing that were shaped by wartime urgency. The knowledge that deploying an imperfect weapon quickly might be better than waiting for a perfect one that arrived too late. These decisions produced in some cases weapons with known deficiencies that cost lives because the waiting for their correction was considered less acceptable than the operational risk of deploying them. The moral dimension of this technical waiting, the trade-off between time required for adequate development and the operational cost of delay, was one of the less visible but genuinely significant ethical dimensions of wartime weapons production. Fact number 34. Among the most remarkable human stories of wartime waiting were those of the Japanese soldiers who continued fighting in remote jungle locations long after the war had ended, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, because no reliable information about the surrender had reached them, or because they refused to believe the information they received. Hiro Onoda, who continued fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended, is the most famous of these cases, but he was not alone. The phenomenon of Japanese holdouts who continued their individual wars in the jungles of the Philippines, Guam, and other Pacific islands for months or years after August 1945 represents perhaps the most extreme form of wartime waiting in the entire history of the conflict. Men who were waiting for a relief or a resolution that had already occurred, whose waiting had become entirely disconnected from the reality it was nominally directed toward, and who had reconstructed their understanding of their situation in ways that made the waiting feel purposeful even as it became increasingly detached from any connection to the actual war. The psychological study of how and why these soldiers maintained their positions has produced important insights into the relationship between institutional loyalty, information isolation, and the human capacity to sustain a behavior indefinitely once it has been embedded as a fundamental expression of identity and duty. Fact number 35. Throughout occupied Europe, the families of men who had been taken as forced laborers to Germany waited for news of their whereabouts and well-being in conditions of near-total information deprivation that made the waiting a form of sustained grief without a clear object or a clear ending. A French wife whose husband had been conscripted into the service du travail obligatoire and transported to a German factory might go months without a letter, knowing only that he had been sent somewhere in Germany and that the address she had been given for correspondence might or might not still be valid as bombing raids and military movements disrupted the German industrial landscape. The specific quality of this waiting, for news of a specific person in a specific unknown location, from within a country that was occupied and whose communications were censored and unreliable, was something that hundreds of thousands of families endured with a patience and a practical management of uncertainty that personal accounts describe with a matter-of-factness that is itself a measure of how thoroughly the waiting had been woven into the fabric of daily life. The normalization of indefinite waiting as an ordinary feature of existence, the integration of not knowing into the daily routine in a way that allowed life to continue around it, was one of the most demanding and most quietly impressive psychological adaptations of the wartime civilian experience. Fact number 36. The waiting experienced by commanders who had set an operation in motion and were receiving only fragmentary and delayed information about its progress was one of the most distinctive and most consistently described forms of wartime waiting in the memoirs of the war's senior leaders. Montgomery during El Alamein, Patton during the breakout from Normandy, MacArthur during the liberation of the Philippines, all describe in their accounts of these operations the specific and peculiar quality of a commander's waiting during an engagement that has been launched and is now beyond his direct control, developing according to its own momentum and the decisions of subordinates and opponents whose actions he can influence but not determine. The communications technology of the Second World War was sophisticated enough to provide commanders with significantly more real-time information about ongoing operations than any previous war had allowed, but it was not sophisticated enough to eliminate the fundamental uncertainty of the fog of war. The waiting of command during active operations was therefore a waiting simultaneously saturated with incoming information and persistently inadequate in its understanding of the actual situation, a paradox of modern military command that the war's leaders managed with varying degrees of skill and temperament. Fact number 37. Merchant seamen in the Atlantic convoys who had survived a U-boat attack, who had been in the water, been rescued by escort vessels, and returned to port, faced a specific form of waiting when they were asked, and in some cases required, to return to sea. The waiting before a second or third convoy was shaped by a knowledge that the first voyage had already provided, a direct, embodied, specific knowledge of what a torpedo attack actually felt like, what the water was actually like, what survival actually required, that the vague anticipatory fear of a first voyage could not replicate. Some men refused to return and faced the social and sometimes legal consequences of that refusal. Others returned with a matter-of-factness that their shipmates found either admirable or slightly alarming. Most returned carrying the full weight of their previous experience through every hour of the crossing, a specific and unavoidable form of waiting informed by memory rather than imagination, that carried a quality of resignation and determination observers described as one of the most quietly impressive forms of courage they encountered anywhere in the war. The merchant seamen who crossed the Atlantic multiple times during the worst years of the U-boat campaign were not trained for combat and received none of the institutional support that military personnel were given. They were simply doing their job, crossing the same water that had already nearly killed them, waiting for whatever it would bring this time. Fact number 38. The period between the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 and the eventual invasion of Sicily in July 1943, approximately 8 months, was a waiting period for Allied forces in the Mediterranean filled with hard fighting in Tunisia, but also with a strategic limbo whose resolution was uncertain for much of the period. The debate among Allied commanders and political leaders about what to do after North Africa, whether to invade Sicily and then Italy, whether to attempt a cross-channel operation in 1943, whether to focus resources on the Pacific, was a strategic waiting that had direct consequences for the operational waiting of the troops in the field. They were training for operations whose character and timing was still being determined by people in conference rooms in Casablanca and Washington and London. The specific frustration of military personnel who were ready for the next operation but whose readiness was being held in suspension by strategic debates they were not party to and could not influence was a recurring feature of the war's waiting. The impatience of the sharp end of the military machine for decisions that the political and strategic levels had not yet made, experienced by soldiers who understood that the decision was complicated, who were ready to move, and who found the waiting increasingly difficult to justify against the evidence of their own preparedness. Fact number 39. Throughout the war years, meteorologists occupied a specific and often underappreciated position within the military planning apparatus, the people whose forecasts determined whether operations proceeded or waited, and whose professional uncertainty about the future state of the atmosphere translated directly into operational uncertainty for commanders who needed reliable weather data to plan effectively. The meteorologists who provided the forecast for D-Day, working with data from weather stations across the North Atlantic, from ships at sea, and from the limited aerial reconnaissance that was possible, were making predictions at the outer edge of what 1940s meteorological science could reliably deliver. The confidence with which they presented their forecasts was itself a form of professional courage, the willingness to commit to a prediction on which thousands of lives and a major strategic operation depended, knowing that the science underlying it was not adequate to eliminate significant uncertainty. The waiting that their forecasts resolved or extended was the most consequential meteorological waiting in military history. The 24-hour postponement of D-Day from June the 5th to June the 6th, and the decision to proceed on the 6th despite continuing uncertainty about the weather window, were decisions made by Eisenhower on the basis of meteorological advice he trusted sufficiently to act on, but could not verify until the morning came. Fact number 40. Children who grew up during the war years experienced the waiting of that time in ways shaped by their developmental stage and by how the adults around them communicated or concealed what was being waited for. Young children too small to understand the nature of the war were nevertheless immersed in its waiting atmosphere, absorbing the anxiety and suspended quality of adult life in ways they could not articulate but that shaped their emotional development in ways researchers have since identified as significant. Older children and adolescents who understood more of what was happening experienced a waiting complicated by their developmental position, old enough to comprehend the danger and the uncertainty, too young to have any meaningful agency over their situation, and therefore inhabiting a form of waiting that combined the child's powerlessness with the adolescent's heightened emotional awareness of everything they could not control. The diaries kept by adolescents during the war years, Anne Frank's being the most famous but by no means the only example, document this specific form of youthful waiting with an emotional precision and a self-awareness that adult accounts sometimes lack, capturing the particular quality of growing up inside a suspended world where the future was uncertain and the waiting had no reliable end in sight. Fact number 41. Snipers in every theater of the war occupied perhaps the most extreme version of the military waiting experience, men whose entire operational effectiveness depended on their capacity to remain completely still, completely silent, and completely alert for hours or sometimes days at a time, waiting for a single moment of opportunity that might arrive or might not, and that would be gone in a fraction of a second if the waiting had not been conducted with absolute discipline. The sniper's waiting was not the passive waiting of someone enduring enforced inactivity. It was an intensely active form of sustained attention, the management of the body's discomfort, the control of breathing, the suppression of every physical impulse toward movement, all maintained simultaneously while the mind remained genuinely focused on a field of view that might produce an opportunity at any moment. Soviet female snipers, who served in significant numbers on the Eastern Front and achieved some of the highest confirmed kill records of the war, described the waiting between shots in terms that emphasized its psychological demands as much as its physical ones. The discipline required to remain in position through cold, through hunger, through the physical urgency of bodily needs, and through the specific and corrosive pressure of sustained stillness in a dangerous environment where movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Fact number 42. Between the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and the decisive Soviet counteroffensive at Kursk in July 1943, the Eastern Front underwent a series of dramatic swings in military fortune separated by periods of operational pause, periods in which both sides were rebuilding, resupplying, and preparing for the next major engagement, while civilian populations in the affected territories endured a waiting shaped by the specific terror of not knowing which direction the front would move next. Soviet civilians in the areas between the German advance and the Soviet defensive lines lived in a state of suspended terror during these operational pauses, knowing that the front might stabilize where it was, might advance toward them, or might recede, and having no reliable information about which of these outcomes was more likely. The waiting of civilians caught in the path of the Eastern Front's movements was perhaps the most acutely terrifying form of wartime waiting. Not the abstract uncertainty of a distant conflict, but the immediate and specific uncertainty of a military situation that might, within days or weeks, arrive at their village, their house, their door. The management of daily life under this form of waiting, whether to stay or flee, whether to hide food or move it, whether to prepare for occupation or for liberation, required a constant and exhausting re-evaluation of available information against an impossibly uncertain backdrop. Fact number 43. Ground crews at Royal Air Force fighter stations during the Battle of Britain spent their operational days in a form of waiting that oscillated between frantic activity and complete stillness with a speed and an unpredictability that made the management of readiness one of the primary challenges of their role. When a scramble order came, the ground crew's waiting ended in an instant. Aircraft had to be armed, fueled, and ready for departure within minutes, and the efficiency of the ground crew's preparation directly affected the survival odds of the pilot who climbed into the cockpit. Between scrambles, the ground crew waited in a state of maintained readiness that could not be allowed to degrade regardless of how long the waiting lasted, because the next scramble might come in the next minute or the next hour, and the aircraft had to be ready either way. The ground crews of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain are among the less celebrated contributors to its outcome. The pilots received the recognition that the visibility and drama of aerial combat provided, while the men and women who kept the aircraft flying through the operational tempo of the summer and autumn of 1940 worked in a waiting that was as demanding in its way as anything experienced in the air above them. Fact number 44. Wartime diplomats stationed in neutral countries, in Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, experienced a form of waiting that was comfortable in its material conditions but psychologically demanding in its specific character. They were not in physical danger in the direct sense that soldiers and civilians in occupied or bombed territories were, but they were living in a sustained state of intelligence gathering, negotiation, and strategic observation that required the maintenance of alertness and professional judgment across years of service in countries where the war's outcome was uncertain and their own government's policies were subject to constant revision. The neutral country diplomat was waiting, in a sense, for the war to resolve itself into the outcome that would determine whether the relationships and the intelligence they had been cultivating across years of patient work had been invested in the right directions. Swiss-based diplomats who had developed contacts with German officials willing to negotiate a separate peace were waiting for a political situation that never fully materialized. Swedish diplomats monitoring the shifting fortunes of the Nordic countries were waiting to understand which way the war's final resolution would push the specific geopolitical situation their country occupied. The neutral country waiting was one of the most patient and most professionally demanding forms of wartime waiting, conducted without the moral clarity that active belligerence provided. Fact number 45. Throughout the North African campaign, the soldiers of the Long-Range Desert Group conducted operations behind enemy lines that involved days and sometimes weeks of waiting in concealed positions, observing enemy movements, waiting for the specific intelligence their reconnaissance mission required, enduring the physical demands of desert concealment while maintaining the discipline of immobility that discovery would punish immediately and severely. The Long-Range Desert Group's operations required a specific combination of physical toughness, navigational skill, and the capacity for sustained patient waiting that the conventional military culture of the time did not always recognize as a primary military virtue. The men selected for these operations were chosen partly for their technical skills and physical fitness, but equally for a psychological temperament that could manage the specific demands of long-duration concealment operations without the institutional support of conventional military service. They operated in small groups, far from any help, in a landscape that amplified both the physical demands of concealment and the psychological isolation of extended waiting. Their operational reports, preserved in the British National Archives, are models of professional understatement, describing days of concealed observation in extreme heat with the same matter-of-fact brevity they applied to the firefights that sometimes preceded or followed the observation phase, in a prose style that perfectly captured the specific equanimity that their kind of waiting required. Fact number 46. Something that the historical record of wartime waiting captures with unexpected emotional power is the role of music in marking time and managing the psychological demands of extended periods of inactivity and uncertainty. Soldiers waiting in camp or in transit sang, whistled, and played whatever instruments were available, not as entertainment in the ordinary peacetime sense, but as a form of active time management, a way of imposing structure and meaning on hours that would otherwise have been shapeless. The songs that became most associated with the wartime waiting experience, Lili Marleen, which was broadcast by German military radio and taken up by Allied soldiers with equal enthusiasm, We'll Meet Again, which addressed the waiting of separation with a directness that made it one of the defining emotional documents of the entire war, were popular not only because they were musically appealing, but because they spoke directly to the specific emotional conditions of the waiting. They named the waiting, they acknowledged its difficulty, and they offered, in place of its resolution, a form of communal recognition that the waiting was real and shared and survivable. The music of the wartime waiting was not an escape from the waiting's reality. It was an engagement with that reality, a way of making the unbearable slightly more bearable by setting it to a tune that could be sung together. Fact number 47. The waiting experienced by families of men listed as missing in action was one of the most prolonged and most psychologically complex forms of wartime waiting, because it was a waiting without a clear object. Waiting that could not be directed toward any specific expected outcome and that therefore had no natural conclusion available to it. A family that received notification that a husband or son was missing in action entered a legal and emotional limbo that the official systems of the time were completely inadequate to address. The notification provided no information about whether the person was alive, wounded, captured, or dead, only that their whereabouts were unknown. The waiting that followed was therefore open-ended in a way that bereavement, however devastating, was not. It could not resolve into grief because there was no confirmed loss to grieve, and could not resolve into relief because there was no confirmed survival to celebrate. Families of the missing developed their own strategies for managing this waiting, maintaining contact with military records officers, writing to returned veterans who might have information, keeping the missing person's room unchanged, continuing to set their place at the table. These strategies were simultaneously methods of maintaining hope and methods of managing a grief that had no acknowledged right to exist, because the loss it was mourning had not been officially confirmed. Fact number 48. Wartime cartoonists and illustrators who worked for military newspapers and magazines across multiple national forces developed, over the course of the war, a visual language for the specific experience of military waiting that their readers recognized and responded to with a warmth that spoke to how accurately it captured their actual daily experience. Bill Mauldin's Willie and Joe cartoons in the American Stars and Stripes newspaper were perhaps the most celebrated example. Infantry soldiers depicted in their authentic waiting condition, muddy and exhausted and sardonic, waiting in foxholes and in ruins and in the rain with a specific quality of patient, weary endurance that official military imagery never attempted to capture. The waiting that Mauldin drew was not romantic or heroic. It was cold and wet and boring and exhausted, and the men who read the cartoons recognized it immediately as the truth of their own daily experience, a recognition that produced in them a specific form of relief, the relief of seeing something real acknowledged in a context where the gap between official military representation and actual military experience was enormous and was usually navigated in silence. The cartoonist who drew the waiting honestly was performing, in his own medium, the same function as the diary writer and the letter writer, bearing witness to the actual texture of what the war felt like from the inside. Fact number 49. The months between the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 and the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 involved a strategic waiting on the Eastern Front during which both sides understood that a decisive summer offensive was coming, but neither could be certain of the other's precise intentions, timing, or axis of advance. The German High Command debated through the spring of 1943 whether to proceed with Operation Citadel, the pincer attack on the Kursk salient that eventually became the largest tank battle in history, and the repeated postponements of the operation's start date, driven by Hitler's desire to wait for additional Tiger and Panther tank production, had the unintended consequence of giving Soviet forces time to construct the most elaborate defensive system in military history. The Soviets, forewarned of the German plan through the Lucy spy network and partisan intelligence, used every day of the German waiting to dig additional lines of anti-tank ditches, lay millions of mines, and position their reserves for the counter-offensive they planned to launch as soon as the German attack had exhausted itself. The waiting of the Kursk preparation period was therefore a waiting in which one side was unknowingly providing the other with exactly the time it needed to build the defenses that would defeat the offensive the first side was waiting to launch. Fact number 50. Ships at anchor in harbor, waiting for convoy assignments or repair completion or the arrival of orders that had not yet come through, created their own specific environments of naval waiting that were experienced differently depending on the ship's function, the length of the wait, and the quality of the port facilities available. A destroyer waiting in Scapa Flow for a convoy escort assignment was waiting in a harbor that was itself a kind of military institution, organized around the management of waiting in ways that the Royal Navy had developed across generations of fleet management. The sailors on board had routines, had access to shore leave within the limits of operational security, and had the institutional structures of ship life to provide the daily framework that military waiting required. A merchant vessel waiting in a North African port for a return convoy had its crew in a very different situation, in a port that might be strange, with limited facilities, waiting for a departure subject to the operational priorities of escort vessels they did not control, in an environment that was simultaneously foreign and institutional, and that lacked the specific social familiarity of a home port. The variety of naval waiting environments across different theaters and different categories of vessel was enormous, and the experience of that waiting was shaped as much by the specific physical and social environment of the waiting, as by the abstract fact of the delay itself. Fact number 51. Refugees who reached neutral countries during the war years and who spent months or years in those countries waiting for the conditions that would allow them to move to a permanent destination experienced a specific and psychologically demanding form of waiting that combined destination experienced a specific and psychologically demanding form of waiting that combined destination experienced a specific and psychologically demanding form of waiting that combined destination experienced a specific and psychologically demanding form of waiting that combined destination experienced a specific and psychologically demanding form of waiting. Fact number 51. Physical safety with a deep structural uncertainty about the future. Jewish refugees who had reached Switzerland, Sweden, or Portugal by the middle years of the war were out of immediate danger, but in most cases were unable to work legally, unable to make permanent plans, and uncertain about whether the destination they were hoping to reach, Palestine, the United States, South America, would ultimately be accessible to them. The waiting of the wartime refugee in a neutral country was simultaneously relief and suspension, the relief of having escaped the most immediate danger, and the suspension of being unable to begin the new life that escape had been supposed to make possible. Some of these refugees waited for the entire remainder of the war in their temporary refuges, spending years in a liminal condition that was neither the catastrophe they had escaped nor the new beginning they were hoping for, managing the specific psychological demands of an extended uncertainty whose resolution depended on the outcome of a war whose progress they were following from a position of helpless and anxious attention. Fact number 52. Tank crews waiting in their vehicles at the start line of a major armored operation experienced a form of pre-combat waiting that had specific physical and psychological dimensions shaped by the particular environment of armored warfare. A tank at the start line was a sealed metal space in which 4 or 5 men waited in a physical proximity that peacetime norms of personal space would have made uncomfortable, breathing air already slightly fouled by exhaust and machinery, in temperatures that were either cold or suffocating depending on the season and the theater, listening to their own engine and the engines of the surrounding vehicles and the sounds of whatever was happening beyond their armored walls. A combination of physical confinement, sensory limitation, and the anticipatory stress of imminent combat produced a waiting environment that tank veterans described with a consistent emphasis on its claustrophobic quality, the sense of being sealed inside a machine that was simultaneously a weapon and a target, unable to see clearly, unable to move freely, unable to do anything except wait for the order that would set the machine in motion and transform the waiting into whatever the next hours would bring. The relief of beginning to move when it finally came was described by virtually every tank veteran as one of the most purely physical forms of relief they had ever experienced, the release of a specific tension that the human body was not designed to hold indefinitely. Fact number 53. War correspondents who covered the Second World War spent a significant proportion of their time in a form of professional waiting that was less glamorous than the dramatic dispatches they eventually filed, but that was as much a feature of their working lives as the combat situations that generated their most important reporting. A correspondent attached to a military unit in a quiet period was waiting for the event that would justify a dispatch, waiting alongside the soldiers whose experience they were documenting, sharing the physical conditions of the waiting but experiencing it through a different professional lens. The correspondent's waiting was complicated by the knowledge that the event they were waiting for, the combat, the crisis, the dramatic development that would make a story, was the same event that would put them and the soldiers around them in immediate danger. This specific moral complexity was something that the best of the wartime correspondents acknowledged honestly in their memoirs. Ernie Pyle, whose dispatches from the European and Pacific theaters brought the infantry soldiers' waiting experience to American readers with a fidelity and compassion that earned him enormous popular respect, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on Ieshima in April 1945, an ironic and brutal end to a career defined by the patient, honest, dangerous work of waiting alongside the men whose story he had told. Fact number 54. Throughout the war years, military chaplains served a function within the waiting culture of military service that went beyond their official religious role, one that the men who valued their presence described in terms that were as much psychological as spiritual. A chaplain who moved through a unit during the long days of waiting before a major operation was providing something that neither the military command structure nor the medical services could adequately supply, a form of human presence that was simultaneously authoritative and non-threatening, that invited the expression of fear and doubt without the social costs that expressing those things to a commanding officer or to fellow soldiers could impose. Soldiers who would not tell their sergeant that they were frightened sometimes found in the chaplain a person to whom the full honesty of their emotional state could be disclosed without consequence. The waiting before combat was one of the periods when chaplains reported the highest demand for their presence. Men who were managing the specific psychological pressure of imminent danger reached for spiritual and emotional resources that ordinary military life did not provide, and that the waiting's intensity made suddenly and urgently necessary. The chaplain's role in the management of military waiting was one of the most practically important and least officially recognized dimensions of wartime psychological welfare. Fact number 55. Japan's civilian population during the final year of the war endured a form of waiting that was unique in its particular combination of pressures, waiting for an Allied invasion that the government was actively preparing civilians to resist, waiting through an intensifying campaign of firebombing that was destroying their cities, and waiting within an official information environment that continued to deny the true state of the military situation until the very moment of surrender. The waiting of Japanese civilians in 1945 was therefore a waiting conducted in deliberate ignorance that was in some cases genuine because the information had not reached them, and in other cases performative, because people suspected or knew more than they were able to acknowledge within the social and political context of a society at war. Japanese memorists and historians have explored this with increasing frankness in the decades since the war, producing accounts of the 1945 civilian experience that reveal the internal complexity of a waiting simultaneously collective and intensely private. The announcement of surrender on August 15, 1945, ended the waiting in a way that was simultaneously a relief and a profound shock. A confirmation of what many had privately feared, arriving in a form that the public language of the preceding months had given them no preparation to receive. Fact number 56. The waiting experienced by the architects and planners of the post-war international order, the diplomats and officials who worked through the war years on the frameworks for the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, and the other institutions that would govern the post-war world, was a form of constructive waiting whose product would shape international relations for generations. The planning for the post-war order began in earnest before the war's outcome was certain, in conditions where the specific shape of the world that these institutions were being designed to manage was itself uncertain. American, British, and in some cases Soviet officials working on these plans were designing frameworks for a world that did not yet exist, for problems whose specific character they could not entirely anticipate, knowing that the political will to implement their designs was contingent on a war whose outcome was not yet secured. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference of 1944, which laid the groundwork for the United Nations, was attended by delegations still fighting a war whose end was not yet clearly in sight, working on structures whose purpose was the prevention of the next war while the current one was still in progress. The specific quality of this waiting, building the future while fighting for the present, was one of the more remarkable dimensions of the wartime diplomatic experience. Fact number 57. Coast watchers in the Pacific, Allied intelligence operatives who remained on the Japanese-occupied islands observing enemy ship and aircraft movements, experienced a form of wartime waiting that combined the extreme isolation of their physical situation with the specific professional obligation to observe and report rather than to act. A coast watcher stationed on a Japanese-occupied island in the Solomon Islands was waiting, in the most fundamental sense, for the information that would justify a radio transmission, watching the horizon for the Japanese naval movements whose reporting was the entire purpose of his presence. The waiting between transmissions was shaped by the specific danger of his situation. The Japanese were aware that Allied coast watchers were operating on their occupied islands and conducted systematic searches to find and eliminate them. The discipline required to observe without acting, to gather information without revealing presence, and to maintain the concealment that survival required while conducting the observation that purpose required, was one of the most demanding forms of professional patience the war produced. The coast watchers of the Pacific, many of them pre-war colonial administrators, planters and traders who knew the islands and their populations intimately, provided intelligence that contributed directly to several of the war's most important Pacific operations, including the Guadalcanal campaign, at a personal cost that their small numbers and institutional obscurity have prevented from receiving the recognition their contribution warranted. Fact number 58. The development of the jet engine, the rocket, and other advanced technologies during the war years involved their engineers in a form of technical waiting whose specific character was shaped by the race between German and Allied development programs that both sides were conducting simultaneously and that neither could observe directly. German engineers working on the V-2 rocket at Peenemünde and on the Me-262 jet fighter were waiting for the technical solutions that would make their designs operationally viable, in a context where military urgency and political pressure from the Nazi leadership created conditions of extreme stress not conducive to the patient, systematic work that engineering development requires. Allied engineers and intelligence analysts monitoring German advanced weapons development, through whatever intelligence was available, were waiting for information that would tell them how close the German programs were to operational deployment, information that would determine the urgency of countermeasures and the priority assigned to disrupting German development facilities. The bombing of Peenemünde in August 1943, which killed several key German rocket engineers and set the V-2 program back by months, was the result of intelligence-driven waiting, the patient accumulation of information about the program's location and progress that eventually justified the operational risk of a major bombing raid on a heavily defended target at extreme range. Fact number 59. Field hospitals, established in the immediate rear areas of active fronts, maintained a state of readiness that required the sustained management of preparedness across periods of variable duration and unpredictable timing, a form of medical waiting defined by the impossibility of knowing when the next major casualty flow would arrive and how large it would be. The medical staff who maintained these facilities during the relatively quiet periods between major offensives were engaged in the specific professional discipline of maintaining clinical readiness, keeping equipment sterile and organized, maintaining staff rotation schedules that preserved the rest necessary for effective performance while ensuring adequate coverage, managing the supply chains that kept the facility stocked with blood, anesthetics, and surgical materials that a major casualty event would require. The specific, psychological challenge of medical waiting was the maintenance of clinical empathy and professional engagement across periods of idleness that could last days or weeks and that were always succeeded by periods of extreme pressure demanding the full mobilization of everything the waiting period had been supposed to maintain. Medical personnel who allowed their readiness to degrade during quiet periods paid for it in the quality of care they could provide when the waiting ended and the work began. Fact number 60. The final weeks before the German surrender in May 1945 produced a form of waiting whose specific character was shaped by the visible and rapidly approaching end of the European War. A waiting simultaneously informed by the certainty that the end was near and complicated by the continuing danger that the not yet ended war still presented. Soldiers advancing through Germany in April 1945 were doing so in a military situation that was clearly and irreversibly moving toward conclusion, but in which the German forces they encountered continued to resist with a ferocity that made the last weeks of the European war some of the most dangerous of the entire conflict. The waiting of the final weeks was therefore inflected by a specific and cruel irony, the knowledge that survival now, when the war was nearly over, would mean something that survival earlier had not meant in quite the same way, because the end was so close and so visible and so certain. Men who had survived years of combat were killed in the last days of the European war by an enemy whose strategic defeat was complete but whose tactical resistance was not. The specific grief of families who lost someone in April 1945, so close to the end, with the peace measurable in weeks, carried a quality that the passage of time has not entirely diminished, and that the final week's particular form of waiting had made almost unbearably poignant. Fact number 61. Ammunition depots maintained behind front lines required their custodians to perform one of the most psychologically paradoxical forms of wartime waiting, the careful and patient management of materials whose entire purpose was violent and whose presence in the waiting environment created a specific background awareness of danger that could not be entirely set aside even during the quietest operational periods. The men and women who worked in ammunition storage and handling facilities spent their working days surrounded by the concentrated potential for catastrophic destruction, managing it with a procedural discipline whose rigor was the direct expression of the consequences of lapses. Accidents in ammunition depots were not ordinary industrial accidents. They were events of catastrophic scale that could kill hundreds of people and destroy months of accumulated supply in seconds. The specific form of waiting required by ammunition depot work therefore demanded the maintenance of absolute procedural discipline, not just when the work was active, but during every quiet moment, the discipline of handling that could not be relaxed during the tedium of routine, because the tedium of routine was precisely the condition in which dangerous relaxation was most likely to occur. The men and women who maintained that discipline across years of wartime service performed a form of sustained, careful patience whose contribution to the war effort was invisible precisely because it worked. Fact number 62. Across the vast steppes of the Soviet Union during the winter campaigns of 1941 and 1942, German soldiers who had expected a swift victory found themselves in a waiting state that the Russian winter imposed with a physical absoluteness that no military planning had adequately anticipated. The Wehrmacht had been designed, equipped, and trained for the kind of rapid mobile warfare that the campaign's original schedule had envisioned. A campaign concluded before winter made sustained operations in the Russian climate impossible. When the campaign did not conclude on schedule, the German soldiers who found themselves waiting in temperatures that fell to -40 degrees Celsius were waiting in a physical environment that the human body was not designed to endure without the specific equipment and preparation that the German military had not provided. On the assumption that the waiting would not be necessary, men froze at their posts, vehicles would not start, weapons mechanisms seized in the cold. The specific quality of the Russian winter waiting was not simply discomfort or danger, but a systematic dismantling of operational capability that the German army could not prevent because the resources required to address it had not been prepared. The waiting of the Russian winter was one of the most consequential strategic failures of the entire war. The result of a planning assumption that the war would be over before waiting in the cold became a problem that needed to be solved. Fact number 63. Between major naval engagements in the Pacific, the enormous fleet of American aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that the United States assembled from 1943 onward spent significant periods at anchor in forward bases like Alethi Atoll, a waiting organized around the maintenance and resupply of vessels that had been operating at the extreme limits of their range and endurance. Alethi, a remote atoll in the Caroline Islands that most Americans had never heard of before the war, became at its peak one of the largest naval bases in history, a lagoon filled with hundreds of warships waiting for the next operation, their crews resting, their engines being serviced, their magazines being replenished from the fleet train of supply vessels that followed the American advance across the Pacific. The specific character of fleet anchorage waiting was shaped by the scale of the assembled force. The visual spectacle of hundreds of warships filling a lagoon was itself a form of strategic communication, a physical demonstration of the industrial and naval power that the American war effort had produced, waiting for the next application. Sailors who described Ulithi in their letters home wrote about the strange beauty of the assembled fleet at anchor, the thousands of lights reflected in the lagoon at night, the scale of something that peacetime life had given them no preparation to imagine. Fact number 64. Political leaders of occupied countries who had established governments in exile, the Norwegian government in London, the Polish government in exile, the Free French under de Gaulle, the Dutch government, experienced a form of waiting that was politically, emotionally, and diplomatically among the most demanding of the entire war. These leaders were simultaneously responsible for maintaining the legitimacy of their governments in the eyes of their occupied populations, managing the relationship with their host governments whose support was essential and whose priorities were not always aligned with their own, and preparing for the eventual return to their liberated countries. The Polish government in exile occupied a particularly painful position, watching as the Soviet Union's advancing armies raised questions about the post-war political fate of Poland that the Allied powers were managing in ways the Polish government found increasingly alarming, and being unable to influence the decisions being made about their country's future by the great powers on whose military efforts Poland's liberation depended. The waiting of the governments in exile was therefore a waiting conducted in full political consciousness of the gap between the nominal authority their governmental status conferred and the actual power they could exercise over the decisions that would determine the fate of the countries and the people they represented. Fact number 65. Something that veteran accounts of wartime waiting return to with striking consistency is the central role that food played in the management of time during extended periods of military inactivity. Not food as nutrition or even as pleasure, but food as temporal structure, as a marker of the day's passage, as one of the primary activities around which the otherwise shapeless hours of waiting could be organized. The preparation of food in field conditions, the heating of rations over small stoves, the brewing of tea or coffee over whatever heat source was available, the creative supplementation of official rations with whatever could be obtained locally, was not simply a matter of feeding the body. It was a way of imposing a rhythm on the day, of creating occasions that marked the morning from the afternoon from the evening, of providing an activity that engaged the hands and the attention in ways that the waiting otherwise failed to provide. The centrality of the meal to the management of military waiting was recognized by experienced commanders who understood that the quality of food their units received during quiet periods was not simply a welfare matter but an operational one. That men who were adequately fed and whose mealtimes were organized with care and regularity were psychologically better prepared for the demands of active service than men whose nutrition was adequate but whose eating was as shapeless and unstructured as the waiting it was supposed to punctuate. Fact number 66. The island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, where American and Filipino forces held out against the Japanese advance for 5 months after the fall of the Philippine mainland, from January to May 1942, was the site of one of the most sustained and concentrated forms of siege waiting in the Pacific War. The garrison, which eventually numbered approximately 15,000 soldiers and civilians in the tunnel complex beneath the island's surface, knew from a very early stage of the siege that relief was not coming, that the strategic situation in the Pacific made reinforcement impossible, and that their resistance was being continued not in expectation of relief, but as a delaying action whose value was independent of its military outcome. Waiting in the knowledge that you are not going to be relieved, that the siege will end in defeat rather than in liberation, and that the only question is not whether but when and in what form. This is perhaps the most psychologically demanding form of siege waiting that a military force can be asked to endure. The men and women on Corregidor who maintained their resistance for 5 months under these circumstances were waiting not for victory but for the specific form of their defeat, and doing so with a discipline and a professionalism that their eventual captors acknowledged and that the military history of the Pacific War has never adequately recognized. Fact number 67. Between the Allied liberation of Rome in June 1944 and the final German surrender in Italy in May 1945, a period of nearly 11 months, the soldiers of the Allied armies in Italy endured one of the most grinding and most psychologically demanding waiting experiences of the entire European war. The Italian campaign had already been running for nearly a year before Rome fell, and the fall of Rome was almost immediately overshadowed by the D-Day landings in Normandy 2 days later, which redirected Allied command attention and resources away from Italy at precisely the moment when the Italian campaign might have been exploited more aggressively. The soldiers who fought the remaining 11 months did so in the awareness that they were no longer the primary effort of the Allied war, that the decisive action was happening in France and then Germany, and that their own continued fighting, through the Gothic Line, through the Apennine Winter, through the Spring Offensive of 1945, was being conducted in a strategic environment that had moved on while they remained. The specific psychological difficulty of fighting a campaign that the larger war had partly passed by, of waiting for a conclusion that was happening elsewhere, was one that the soldiers of the Italian campaign bore with a patience and a professionalism that their subsequent relative historical obscurity has not fully honored. Fact number 68. Signal intelligence intercept operators who spent their working hours listening to enemy radio traffic through headphones, picking out the specific frequencies, call signs, and transmission patterns that would give their analysts something to work with, performed one of the most sustained forms of concentrated auditory waiting that the war produced. The work required the maintenance of genuine listening attention across hours of monitoring, not passive hearing but active attention, ready to recognize the specific patterns that indicated traffic worth recording, in a stream of noise and interference and unintelligible coded transmissions that produced the sought-for information only occasionally and unpredictably. The physical and cognitive demands of extended headphone monitoring, the accumulated fatigue of sustained auditory attention, the specific strain of listening through static and interference were recognized by the signals intelligence services as a genuine welfare issue, and the rotation of monitoring shifts and the management of operator fatigue were taken seriously as operational requirements. The intercept operators who worked at WWII service stations around the world, feeding raw traffic to the analysts at Bletchley Park and its equivalents, were performing a form of waiting as essential to the intelligence chain as the cryptanalysis that processed the material they collected, and their contribution was as real and as consequential as any more visible dimension of the signals intelligence effort. Fact number 69. Throughout the occupation of France, the wives and families of French prisoners of war held in Germany, approximately 1.5 million French soldiers had been captured in 1940 and remained in German captivity for the duration of the war, endured a waiting whose specific character was shaped by the particular circumstances of the Franco-German armistice. Unlike the families of men who were actively fighting and whose fate was genuinely uncertain from week to week, the families of French prisoners knew that their men were alive and in German captivity. The armistice had established a prisoner status that the Red Cross monitored and that provided at least a minimal framework of information and occasional correspondence. The waiting of the French prisoners' family was therefore a waiting with more information than most, but still insufficient information to provide genuine reassurance. One that received occasional letters whose content was censored and whose reassurances were sometimes genuine and sometimes strategic, and that had no clear endpoint because the armistice provided no mechanism for its resolution short of a fundamental change in the war's outcome that seemed, from within the occupation, very distant and very uncertain. The specific quality of this French waiting, organized, partly informed, and entirely without agency over its resolution, was one of the more unusual forms of wartime waiting that the particular character of the French defeat had created. Fact number 70. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945 ended, for the survivors who were found there, a waiting that had lasted years and that had in many cases ceased to be experienced as waiting at all, because the capacity to imagine a future in which the waiting might end had itself been among the things that the camp system had attempted to destroy. Survivors found by American, British and Soviet liberating forces in April and May 1945 described their initial reaction to liberation in terms that were consistently and strikingly different from the straightforward joy that the word liberation might suggest. Many described numbness, disbelief, an inability to fully absorb the change in their situation. Some described a physical inability to respond, the body that had organized itself entirely around survival continuing to function in survival mode even after the survival emergency had passed. The specific psychological condition of people emerging from years of extreme captivity into a freedom that their experience had given them no recent practice in inhabiting was one that the liberation forces were entirely unprepared to address, and that the medical understanding of the time was inadequate to fully comprehend. The waiting of the camps had done something to the people inside them that liberation could begin but could not complete. The restoration of the capacity to imagine a future, to make plans, to believe in the possibility of ordinary life, was a process that took not days but months and years, and for some people was never entirely finished. Fact number 71. Gun crews manning coastal defense batteries along the English Channel, the Norwegian coast, and other strategic shorelines spent the majority of their operational service in a form of waiting that combined the tedium of garrison duty with a specific and sustained alertness that the possibility of enemy naval action required them to maintain indefinitely. The coastal defense batteries of the Atlantic Wall, the German defensive system built along the western coast of occupied Europe, were manned throughout the years of their construction and operation by crews waiting for an invasion that came, in most cases, at a different time and a different place from where they were stationed. The men who manned the batteries at Pas de Calais, who had been led to believe by Allied deception operations that the D-Day landings were a feint and that the main invasion was still to come at their position, continued to wait for an attack that never materialized for weeks after the Normandy landings had succeeded, a waiting sustained by deliberate Allied misinformation that tied down significant German forces in positions that were never attacked. The specific utility of prolonged waiting as a strategic tool, the deliberate inducement of waiting in the enemy through deception, was one of the most sophisticated applications of the waiting experience to military strategy that the entire war produced. Fact number 72. Red Cross workers who delivered packages to prisoner of war camps and conducted inspections of camp conditions spent their working lives in a form of humanitarian waiting, waiting for access that host governments could grant or withhold, waiting for responses to reports that recorded conditions requiring improvement but whose improvement depended on the cooperation of the detaining power. The specific frustrations of Red Cross waiting were shaped by the organization's structural dependence on the cooperation of governments that had very different interests in the welfare of the prisoners they held. Access to British and American prisoners held in Germany was generally maintained throughout the war, and Red Cross packages made a genuine and significant contribution to prisoner welfare. Access to Soviet prisoners held by Germany was largely denied. The Soviet Union had not signed the relevant Geneva Conventions, and Germany used this as a pretext to exclude Red Cross inspection of the camps in which approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died from starvation, disease, and deliberate mistreatment. The waiting of the Red Cross for access that Germany refused to grant to Soviet prisoner camps was a waiting that cost millions of lives, the most consequential form of humanitarian waiting that the entire war produced. Fact number 73. Between the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the Battle of Midway in June 1942, a period of 6 months, the United States Navy fought its war in the Pacific from a position of acute strategic weakness, waiting for the industrial mobilization of American shipbuilding capacity to produce the vessels that would eventually give it the strength to take the offensive. The specific character of this early Pacific waiting was shaped by the knowledge of what had been lost at Pearl Harbor and the understanding of how long it would take to replace it. Knowledge that gave every operational decision during those 6 months a specific urgency and a specific caution that the later period of American naval dominance did not require. Admirals who were waiting for ships that had not yet been built, for aircraft that had not yet been delivered, for trained personnel to crew vessels still on the ways in shipyards across the country, were making operational decisions in a context of genuine strategic vulnerability that the public narrative of American wartime confidence sometimes obscured. The waiting of the early Pacific War was not the patient waiting of a power preparing for an offensive from a position of strength. It was the careful, constrained, resource-conscious waiting of a power that had absorbed a devastating blow and was managing its limited remaining resources with extreme care while the industrial capacity to replace them was being assembled. Fact number 74. Throughout the long middle years of the war, the staff of Allied strategic planning departments were engaged in a specific and intellectually demanding form of waiting. The sustained development and revision of operational plans for operations whose timing, resources, and specific parameters were subject to constant change as the strategic situation evolved, as resource allocations shifted, and as the political decisions of the Allied governments moved in and out of alignment with the military priorities their planners were working to address. The planning for Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, involved years of detailed preparatory work revised multiple times as the strategic situation changed and available forces were redirected to other theaters. Planners who had spent months developing a specific operational concept found themselves revising it from scratch when a political decision redirected the resources their plan had depended on. The specific intellectual frustration of planning waiting, the investment of sustained analytical effort in plans whose execution was repeatedly delayed or cancelled, was something that the planning staffs of all the major powers experienced throughout the war, and that the operational histories of the conflict's major campaigns consistently reveal as a significant feature of the planning environment that shaped both the quality of the plans eventually executed and the morale of the people who had been developing them through years of revision and postponement. Fact number 75. Something that the personal accounts of soldiers who fought in the Pacific Island campaigns return to with a consistency that speaks to how deeply it marked them is the specific quality of jungle night, the waiting of darkness in an environment simultaneously visually impenetrable and auditorily overwhelming, in which the sounds of the jungle and the sounds of potential enemy movement were indistinguishable in ways that made maintaining a defensive perimeter at night one of the most psychologically demanding forms of military waiting in the entire war. Men who held positions in the jungle at night were waiting in a darkness so complete that they could not see their hand in front of their face, listening to a soundscape so dense and so unfamiliar that every rustle and snap carried the potential of immediate and lethal threat. The specific fear of the Pacific jungle night was not the fear of a specific and identified danger, but the fear of a danger that could be anywhere and that the darkness prevented from being located. This form of fear, diffuse, unlocatable, sustained across hours of darkness, was one of the most corrosive that the war produced because it had no specific object to respond to and no available action that could address it. The only response was to wait, in the dark, in the noise, until the light came back. Fact number 76. Naval officers aboard submarines that had been detected and were being hunted by destroyer escort vessels experienced perhaps the most acute form of short-duration wartime waiting that the conflict produced. The waiting of depth charge attacks, in which the crew heard the screws of the hunting vessels above them, heard the clicks of the depth charges being released, and then waited the seconds between release and detonation in a silence whose specific quality survivors described with a precision that spoke to how completely it had been registered in their nervous systems. The seconds between the sound of a depth charge being released and the sound of its detonation were described by submarine veterans across multiple navies as among the most subjectively long seconds of their lives. Seconds in which the proximity of the explosion, and therefore the degree of damage it would cause, was entirely uncertain and entirely beyond any influence of the crew. The detonation itself, when it came, was in a paradoxical way a relief. It had happened, its force could be assessed, the damage could be evaluated, and the response could be organized. The waiting for it was worse than the event itself, because the event at least provided information and required action, while the waiting provided nothing except the sustained certainty of imminent and uncontrollable violence whose specific magnitude remained unknown until the moment it arrived. Fact number 77. The women of the Soviet Union who took on agricultural labor, factory work, and military service during the war years, filling the roles left empty by the mobilization of approximately 34 million Soviet men into military service, experienced the waiting of the home front in a form shaped by a combination of extreme physical labor, severe material deprivation, and a specific anxiety about the fate of the men who had gone to the front that the Soviet information environment made particularly difficult to manage. Soviet women working 16-hour days in factories or on collective farms, raising children with whatever resources the wartime economy left available, and receiving information about the front through tightly controlled Soviet media, were waiting in a context that provided both the exhaustion that could make waiting feel less acute and the isolation that could make it feel more so. The letters that Soviet women wrote to their husbands and sons at the front, preserved in archives that Soviet and later Russian historians have only gradually made accessible, document the specific texture of the Soviet home front waiting with a directness and an emotional honesty that the official media of the time entirely failed to capture. They are letters about hunger and cold and exhaustion and longing, written in the quiet moments that 16-hour days of wartime labor occasionally permitted, to men who were somewhere in the enormous geography of the Eastern Front and who might or might not be alive to read them. Fact number 78. The specific form of waiting imposed by the blackout on civilian populations across Britain, Germany, and other countries subject to aerial bombing created a nightly experience of darkness and confinement that was both practically demanding and psychologically significant in ways that accumulated over the years of the war. The blackout required the complete suppression of all visible light from buildings and streets during hours of darkness, a requirement that transformed the ordinary evening hours of domestic life into a carefully managed confinement in which movement outside the home was restricted. The social activities that normally took place in illuminated public spaces were curtailed, and the physical environment of the home itself became the primary container of civilian life during the long winter evenings. The blackout waiting was a specifically domestic form of the general wartime waiting, a nightly compression of civilian social existence into whatever the household contained, an enforced turning inward that extended across thousands of evenings. Families who spent the blackout hours together in a single room, gathered around whatever heat source was available, occupied with reading, mending, listening to the radio, playing games, or simply sitting in a shared silence, were having an experience of domestic intimacy that the normally more dispersed patterns of civilian social life did not produce, and that some survivors later remembered with a warmth that the circumstances producing it did not entirely explain. Fact number 79. Throughout the war years, the families of men serving in the merchant marine occupied a waiting position that was in some respects the most acutely anxious of all the home front waiting experiences, because the merchant marine's casualty rates were among the highest of any service, and because the information available to families about the fate of specific vessels was both delayed and unreliable. A merchant seaman's family knew the approximate route of his convoy but not its specific position, knew the general level of submarine activity in the Atlantic but not the specific tactical situation their family member was sailing through, and received information about specific vessel losses through official notification channels that were slower and less reliable than the rumor networks through which such information tended to circulate first. The specific anxiety of merchant marine family waiting was shaped by the knowledge that the casualty rate was high, that the information flow was poor, and that the institutional frameworks that provided military families with some degree of welfare support were, in many cases, less well developed for merchant marine families than for the families of service personnel. Merchant seamen were not, in the legal and institutional sense, military personnel. They were civilian employees of shipping companies, and this civilian status meant that their families sometimes fell into the gaps between the support systems designed for military families and those designed for civilian workers, occupying a waiting position that was as anxious as any in the war and as inadequately supported as almost any other. Fact number 80. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was itself preceded by a specific and consequential form of waiting. The waiting of American intelligence analysts and military commanders who had accumulated a significant body of evidence pointing toward an imminent Japanese military action somewhere in the Pacific, but who had been unable to determine its specific location, timing, or character with sufficient precision to produce a warning that could have prepared the defenders of Pearl Harbor for what was coming. The pre-Pearl Harbor waiting was not a waiting in ignorance, it was a waiting in partial knowledge, with enough information to know that something was imminent but not enough to know what, where, or when. The specific failure of Pearl Harbor was therefore not a failure of intelligence collection but a failure of intelligence analysis and communication, the failure to recognize, within the accumulated body of available information, the specific pattern that would have indicated the Hawaiian Islands as the target. This failure of analytical waiting, the inability to extract the specific and actionable warning from the general noise of available intelligence, was one of the most consequential failures of the entire war, and its analysis produced significant changes in the organization of American intelligence that shaped the intelligence community's structure and practice for the remainder of the conflict and well into the post-war decades. Fact number 81. Artillerymen waiting for the fire mission order that would send their rounds toward coordinates they could not see occupied a specific and unusual position within the military waiting landscape. Men who were physically safe by the standards of frontline infantry, but who were engaged in a form of lethal action at a distance that required a particular kind of professional detachment. The waiting of an artillery crew between fire missions was the waiting of a technical team maintaining a precision instrument, cleaning the breech, checking the elevation mechanism, confirming ammunition supply, running the calculations that would be needed when the next fire mission coordinates arrived. The work of artillery waiting was more organized and more technically demanding than the waiting of infantry in foxholes, and its structure provided a form of psychological management that the less structured waiting of other arms did not. But the specific psychological dimension of artillery service, the knowledge that the rounds you were sending accurately and professionally toward coordinates on a map were landing among human beings you could not see and whose deaths you would never directly witness, produced its own form of moral and psychological weight that the technical professionalism of the work could organize but could not entirely address. Veterans of artillery service described a specific and persistent distance between themselves and the human consequences of their work, that the accuracy of their craft had imposed and that no amount of reflection entirely resolved. Fact number 82. Between the fall of Singapore in February 1942 and the eventual Allied counter-offensive in Southeast Asia that began in earnest in late 1943, the civilian populations of occupied Malaya, Singapore, and the surrounding region endured nearly 2 years of Japanese occupation waiting in conditions shaped by the specific character of Japanese colonial administration, which combined demands for labor and resources with a systematic humiliation of the European population that had previously held colonial authority. and a complex and varying treatment of the Chinese, Malay, and Indian populations that reflected Japan's own racial hierarchies and strategic calculations. The waiting of occupied Singapore was experienced differently by different communities within the city's diverse population, differently by the Chinese community, which faced the specific hostility of Sukching, differently by the European internees separated from the general civilian population and confined in Changi prison, and differently by the Malay and Indian populations whose experience of the occupation was shaped by Japan's attempts to mobilize them against their former British colonial rulers. The variety of waiting experiences within a single occupied city illustrates something important about the general truth that wartime waiting was never a single experience. It was always a specific one, shaped by identity, circumstance, and the specific intersection of personal situation with the larger forces of the war. Fact number 83. Training camps across the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia processed millions of recruits through programs that were themselves extended exercises in organized waiting, the waiting of men who had volunteered or been conscripted and who were waiting to be transformed, through weeks and months of training, into soldiers capable of the tasks the war required. The specific psychological experience of basic training was shaped by the management of waiting at multiple levels simultaneously, waiting for the next drill, waiting for the next meal, waiting for the end of the current exercise, waiting for the completion of training and the assignment to a unit, waiting for deployment to a theater. The training waiting was managed through a combination of physical exhaustion, strict scheduling, and the progressive accumulation of skills and knowledge that gave the waiting a forward momentum that other forms of military waiting lacked. Men who described their training as the hardest physical experience of their lives were also in many cases describing it as one of the most purposeful periods of their wartime service. The waiting that training involved was a waiting that was visibly and consistently producing something, and the production of something visible was one of the most effective antidotes to the demoralization that purposeless waiting tended to generate. The transformation of a civilian into a soldier was itself a form of waiting, but it was a waiting that moved. Fact number 84. Somewhere in the mountains of Yugoslavia in 1943, a partisan courier was waiting in a farmhouse for the arrival of an Allied liaison officer whose mission had been delayed by weather, by German patrol activity, and by the general operational uncertainty of a guerrilla war in difficult terrain. The courier had been waiting for 3 days, sleeping in the barn, eating whatever the farm family could provide, watching the road for the approach of either the officer he was waiting for or the German patrol that would make the waiting irrelevant in a different and final way. This specific waiting, the waiting of the irregular warfare operative in a situation of tactical uncertainty, with limited information about when or whether the expected event would occur, and with no institutional framework to organize the waiting beyond the specific task that had brought him to the specific place, was one of the most existentially demanding forms of wartime waiting. The partisan networks of Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, and France were sustained by thousands of individual instances of this kind of waiting. People sitting in barns and attics and forest clearings, waiting for a contact who might come or might not, with nothing to do but wait and watch and manage the fear that the waiting generated, because the alternative to the waiting was the abandonment of the mission that had made the waiting necessary. Fact number 85. The planning and preparation for the liberation of the Philippines, which MacArthur had promised to the Filipino people at the moment of his departure from Corregidor in March 1942, involved a waiting of nearly 3 years between the promise and its fulfillment, a waiting that MacArthur himself experienced with an intensity and a personal investment that shaped his strategic priorities throughout the Pacific campaign in ways that his contemporaries sometimes found difficult to reconcile with purely military logic. MacArthur's insistence on the liberation of the Philippines as an operational priority, against the arguments of naval strategists who preferred a more direct approach to Japan through the Central Pacific, was driven partly by genuine military reasoning and partly by the specific personal weight that the promise he had made to the Filipino people carried for him. When he eventually waded ashore at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 and broadcast his announcement that he had returned, the moment ended a waiting that had lasted nearly 3 years and that had been maintained, on both sides, by MacArthur and by the Filipino people who had held on through the occupation, with a fidelity to a specific promise that the war's chaos and uncertainty had not extinguished. Fact number 86. Something that distinguishes the wartime waiting experience from almost every other form of extended waiting in human experience is the specific quality of its uncertainty. Not the ordinary uncertainty of not knowing when something will happen, but the deeper uncertainty of not knowing whether the thing being waited for will happen at all, or will instead be replaced by something entirely different and possibly much worse. A person waiting for a bus knows that the bus will come. The uncertainty is only about the timing. A soldier waiting for an offensive that might be cancelled. A prisoner waiting for a liberation that might not arrive before death. A civilian waiting for news of a missing family member who might be dead. These people were waiting without the foundational certainty that what they were waiting for existed and was coming. This specific quality of wartime uncertainty, the waiting for an outcome whose occurrence could not be assumed, was what gave the waiting its particular psychological weight, and what distinguished it from the ordinary impatience that peacetime waiting typically involves. The management of this deeper uncertainty across months and years required a form of sustained hope that was neither naive optimism nor realistic assessment, but something more disciplined than either: the deliberate maintenance of a functional belief in the possibility of the waited-for outcome, in the absence of any guarantee that the outcome was actually coming. Fact number 87. Medical personnel who worked in psychiatric facilities treating soldiers with combat exhaustion and other psychological injuries during the war years were engaged in a form of therapeutic waiting. The patient, sustained accompaniment of people whose recovery from extreme psychological experiences could not be rushed and whose timeline was determined by internal processes that external intervention could support but not accelerate. The treatment of combat exhaustion, what earlier generations had called shell shock and what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, was one of the areas where wartime medical practice made its most significant advances, partly through the recognition that early intervention produced better outcomes than delayed treatment, and partly through the development of specific therapeutic approaches whose effectiveness depended on the quality of the therapeutic relationship rather than the speed of the treatment. The psychiatrists and medical officers who worked with combat-exhausted soldiers were practicing a form of medicine whose primary therapeutic instrument was time, the time required for the nervous system to begin recovering from the specific physiological effects of extreme stress, and the time required to build the therapeutic relationship within which the psychological dimensions of the experience could begin to be processed. The waiting of psychiatric recovery was among the slowest and most patient forms of wartime waiting, and its practitioners were among the most important and least publicly recognized of the war's medical contributors. Fact number 88. Throughout the war years, lighthouse keepers on remote stations along the coasts of the British Isles, Iceland, and the North American seaboard maintained their lights, sometimes extinguished, sometimes modified, always managed with reference to the operational requirements of the naval war being fought in the surrounding waters, in a form of solitary, sustained waiting that was among the most isolated of any wartime service. The lighthouse keeper's waiting was the waiting of someone whose contribution was the maintenance of a capability rather than its exercise, the keeping of the light, the maintenance of the mechanism, the management of the fuel supply, the recording of the weather and sea conditions that maritime navigation required. In wartime, this work took on an additional dimension, the awareness that the light was part of a naval environment that included not only the Allied convoys it was designed to assist, but the German submarines hunting those convoys, whose knowledge of precise coastal positions the light might inadvertently assist. The management of this dual-use awareness added a specific complexity to the keeper's waiting that peacetime lighthouse keeping had never involved. The men and women who maintained these stations through the war years, often for months at a time in conditions of complete isolation, were performing a form of patient, essential, entirely solitary waiting that the naval war depended on, and that almost nobody noticed, because, when it worked correctly, it produced no dramatic event to notice. Fact number 89. The final months of the war in the Pacific, between the American capture of Okinawa in June 1945 and the Japanese surrender in August 1945, were characterized by a form of operational waiting whose specific quality was shaped by the planning for Operation Downfall, the projected Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. American military planners who had assessed the likely casualties of a home islands invasion, estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially far higher, were waiting for a decision that the atomic bomb eventually made unnecessary, but whose necessity was genuine and whose implications were being managed by planners who did not yet know that an alternative existed. The soldiers and Marines being assembled for Operation Downfall were waiting for an invasion they had been told was coming, an invasion of a country they expected to resist with the same ferocity that Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated, at a scale those battles had not begun to approximate. This waiting was ended abruptly by the atomic bombings of August the 6th and 9th, and the subsequent Japanese surrender announcement of August the 15th, 1945. Fact number 90. Wartime waiting at its most intimate was perhaps best captured not in the grand theaters of military operation, but in the specific and private moment of a soldier reading a letter from home in whatever quiet space the operational tempo permitted, sitting in a foxhole, leaning against a vehicle, sheltering in a doorway, absorbed in words that connected him, for the minutes of reading, to a world that the war had placed at enormous distance and that the letter temporarily collapsed. The letter from home was the primary technology of wartime waiting management for millions of soldiers across every theater of the war, and its role went far beyond the practical exchange of information it nominally provided. A letter was a physical object that had been touched by someone at home, that carried in the texture of the paper and the pressure of the pen something of the presence of the person who had written it. Men who read their letters multiple times, who kept them folded in breast pockets or tucked inside helmet linings, who returned to specific passages from weeks-old letters as anchors during difficult periods, were using the letter as a form of portable connection to everything the war had removed from daily life. The waiting that the letter managed, the specific waiting for the next one, and the sustaining of the interim by the most recent one, was one of the most universal and most human dimensions of the entire wartime experience. Fact number 91. Something that the records of wartime waiting preserve with striking emotional clarity is the specific importance of small personal rituals in the management of extended periods of uncertainty and inactivity. Soldiers who polished their boots with more care than military necessity required, who maintained a small photograph arrangement in their kit with a specific and invariable layout, who performed the same sequence of physical exercises at the same time each morning regardless of operational tempo. These were not simply expressing military discipline or personal fastidiousness. They were creating, through the repetition of specific small acts, a framework of predictability and control within the larger environment of uncertainty and powerlessness that wartime waiting imposed. The personal ritual was a form of agency in a situation that had removed most other forms, a way of making at least one small dimension of the day reliably controllable in a context where almost nothing else was. Psychologists studying the management of chronic uncertainty have identified this ritualization response as one of the most universal and most effective coping mechanisms that human beings employ under conditions of sustained stress, and the wartime evidence for its prevalence is extensive and consistent across multiple cultures, multiple theaters, and multiple categories of wartime experience. The small, private, repeated acts through which wartime people managed their waiting were not trivial. They were genuine and important forms of psychological self-maintenance, practiced without clinical guidance and arrived at through the simple human wisdom of people who had learnt by experience what helped them endure. Fact number 92. Between the Allied landings in southern France in August 1944 and the German surrender in May 1945, the French civilian populations of towns and cities that had been liberated in the summer and autumn of 1944 entered a form of post-liberation waiting that was in some ways as demanding as the occupation waiting it had replaced. The euphoria of liberation was genuine and overwhelming while it lasted, but it was followed within days or weeks by the practical reality of a country still partially occupied, still being fought over in the north and east, and still subject to the economic and social disruptions that the occupation years had created, and that liberation alone did not resolve. Food was still scarce. Infrastructure was still damaged. The men who had been absent, in prisoner of war camps in Germany, in labor deployment, in resistance networks, in the French forces fighting under Allied command, had not yet returned. The waiting that followed liberation was a waiting for the specific personal outcomes that the general liberation had not yet delivered. the return of specific people, the resolution of specific uncertainties, the beginning of the specific personal reconstruction that the end of the occupation had made possible in principle, but that the continuing war and the practical disruptions of the liberation period were still delaying in practice. The post-liberation waiting was in many ways the most poignant form of the entire French wartime waiting, the waiting that knew the end was coming but had not yet arrived at it. Fact number 93. Naval architects and shipyard workers who built the vessels of the wartime fleets experienced a specific form of productive waiting, the waiting embedded in the construction process itself, in which the object being created moved through stages of completion that were each a resolution of the previous stage's waiting and a beginning of the next. The construction of a destroyer from keel laying to commissioning typically took, under peacetime conditions, approximately 2 years. The emergency shipbuilding programs of the war reduced this timeline dramatically. American shipyards eventually commissioned vessels in weeks rather than years, but the compression of the construction timeline was itself a form of managed waiting, in which the urgency of the operational need drove a reorganization of the waiting embedded in the construction process that produced results whose speed was by any previous standard extraordinary. The workers who achieved these construction timelines were managing a complex industrial waiting, the waiting of materials to arrive, of components to be fitted, of systems to be tested and certified, in a context of wartime urgency that transformed the acceptable pace of the work. The ships they built, launched into the water and commissioned into service weeks after their keels had been laid, were monuments to what organized human effort could achieve when the waiting that normally paced the work was compressed by the specific urgency of a war that needed the ships immediately. Fact number 94. Throughout the war years, the staff of military censorship offices processed the letters of millions of soldiers and civilians, reading private correspondence with the dual purpose of preventing the inadvertent disclosure of militarily sensitive information and monitoring the state of morale within the forces and the civilian population. The censorship officer's waiting was the waiting of a reader, the sustained attention to private communications that was simultaneously an act of surveillance and, inevitably, an act of intimate human contact with the specific emotional lives of the people whose letters passed through their hands. Censorship officers who described their work in post-war accounts consistently noted the specific quality of the access it provided to the private emotional lives of people who were writing without any expectation of being read by someone other than the intended recipient. The letters that passed through censorship officers were not carefully composed public statements. They were the genuine, unguarded expressions of people under stress, writing to the people they loved about what they were actually feeling. The censorship officer who spent a working day reading these letters was accumulating a specific and intimate knowledge of what the war felt like from the inside. Knowledge that the official communications of the wartime period never provided, and that the censors were specifically prohibited from sharing or preserving in any form that would allow it to inform the public record. Fact number 95. The waiting experienced by the populations of the liberated countries in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender in May 1945 included, alongside the genuine joy of the war's European ending, a specific and painful form of anticipatory waiting. The waiting for the return of people from prisoner of war camps, labor camps, and concentration camps whose release was now confirmed but whose physical return would take weeks or months to organize through the disrupted transportation networks of a continent whose infrastructure the war had comprehensively damaged. Families who knew that a husband, son, or parent was alive in a camp somewhere in Germany or Poland waited for their physical return in a condition of suspended celebration, joyful in the knowledge of survival, anxious in the uncertainty of the return's timing, and uncertain about the condition in which the returning person would arrive. The reunions that eventually occurred, in railway stations, on doorsteps, in hospital wards, were among the most emotionally complex moments of the entire post-war experience, because the person who returned was often significantly changed from the person who had left, and because the people waiting for them had also changed, and because the relationship between these two changed people had to be rebuilt on the foundation of what had existed before the separation, and in the light of everything that had happened since. Fact number 96. The specific waiting of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors in the days immediately following the atomic bombings, waiting in a landscape of total destruction without adequate medical care. without reliable information about what had happened or what was going to happen, and with a physical environment that continued to kill people through radiation effects that neither the survivors nor the medical authorities attending them initially understood, was one of the most extreme and most disorienting forms of wartime waiting the entire conflict produced. Survivors who had been at sufficient distance from the blast centers to survive the initial explosion and firestorm found themselves in the days that followed in a situation of profound uncertainty. The city around them was destroyed. The normal social and institutional structures that would have organized relief and information were gone, and the specific nature of what had happened was unknown and unimaginable within any framework of previous experience. The waiting of the immediate post-bombing period in both cities was a waiting without any clear frame of reference. The survivors did not know what they were waiting for, because they did not know what had happened, and could not assess their situation against any comparable previous experience, because no comparable previous experience existed. The specific disorientation of waiting inside an event that had no precedent and no available framework for understanding was one of the most profound and most lasting dimensions of the atomic bombing survivors' experience. Fact number 97. Military engineers who built the temporary bridges, roads, and supply routes that enabled army advances to proceed spent their operational lives in a form of waiting structured around the specific moment when their construction would be needed, the moment of the crossing or the advance or the supply run that their work was making possible. Combat engineers who built pontoon bridges across rivers under fire were compressing their waiting into hours of intense preparation followed by the specific and dangerous activity of construction that made the crossing possible. Road engineers who built and maintained supply routes through Italy's mountains or the Pacific's jungles were managing a slower and more sustained form of construction waiting, the gradual accumulation of progress measured in miles of completed road that the operational tempo of the advance required to stay ahead of the rate at which the army behind them was consuming the supply the road was delivering. The engineer's waiting was always purposive, always directed toward a specific construction objective whose completion would enable the next stage of the operation, and this purposiveness gave it a psychological character different from the more passive waiting of arms whose contribution was readiness rather than construction. The engineer was always building something, and the building was always going somewhere, and the place it was going was always eventually the end of the war. Fact number 98. The waiting experienced by the children of wartime left its mark in ways that researchers studying this generation have only gradually come to fully appreciate. Children who spent their formative years inside the suspended time of the war, years in which the adult world around them was organized around waiting for outcomes the children could not understand and could not influence, developed relationships with uncertainty and with the future that were shaped by this early experience in ways that persisted long into their adult lives. The specific developmental impact of growing up inside a sustained collective waiting depended on the age at which the child experienced the war, the specific conditions of their situation, and the quality of the emotional support available to them from the adults around them. Children who experienced the war in its most severe forms, evacuation, bereavement, displacement, occupation, carried more visible marks. Children who experienced it in more moderate forms, rationing, blackouts, the general atmosphere of adult anxiety and suspended normalcy, carried marks that were subtler but no less real. What the wartime children shared, across the range of their different specific experiences, was the early formation of a relationship with time and certainty that the war's waiting had shaped, a knowledge, absorbed before they had the language to articulate it, that the future was not guaranteed, that the present could change without warning, and that the things you loved and relied upon could be taken away faster than you could prepare for their absence. Fact number 99. The waiting that preceded the Japanese surrender announcement of August the 15th, 1945, was experienced differently by different people in ways that reflect the full range of the war's human geography. American sailors in the Pacific who were preparing for the invasion of Japan received the announcement as an ending so sudden and so complete that many described it as initially unbelievable. The thing they had been waiting for had arrived without the gradual approach that waiting normally allows, in a form the waiting itself had not prepared them for. Japanese civilians who heard Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration experienced a moment that ended years of waiting and began a different and equally uncertain form of waiting. The waiting for the occupation, for the assessment of what the country had become, for the beginning of whatever came after everything they had known. The survivors of the concentration camps who heard the news through whatever channels were available to them experienced it as the confirmation of the survival they had been waiting for against the odds of everything around them. Each of these different waitings, American, Japanese, survivor, ended on the same day, and began something new that was different for each of them and that the waiting had prepared them for only partially and imperfectly. The ending of the war was not a single event experienced uniformly. It was a million different endings, each shaped by the specific waiting that had preceded it. Fact number 100. Among the last forms of wartime waiting to resolve itself was the waiting of families for the official recognition of losses that the war's chaos had left unconfirmed and unacknowledged. The bureaucratic processes through which death notifications, missing in action determinations, and prisoner of war status confirmations were communicated to families were overwhelmed by the scale of the casualties the war had produced, and the clearance of this administrative backlog continued for months and sometimes years after the war's end. Families who had spent the final months of the war in uncertainty about the fate of a specific person sometimes did not receive confirmation of death until months after the surrender, continuing to wait in the war's aftermath for the specific resolution of a specific uncertainty that the end of the fighting had not automatically provided. The waiting of the post-war family for official confirmation of a wartime loss was one of the quietest and most private forms of the war's extended waiting. Waiting that occurred after the war was over, in a world that had officially moved on to reconstruction and recovery, for the specific piece of official paper that would allow the specific family to begin the specific process of grief that the uncertainty had been preventing. The administrative aftermath of a war that had killed tens of millions of people generated, in its resolution, millions of individual waitings of this kind, each one the ending of a story that had begun years earlier and that the end of the fighting had not by itself been enough to close. Fact number 101. What remains when all the waiting of the Second World War is finally accounted for? The soldiers in foxholes and the civilians at windows and the prisoners behind wire and the commanders at their maps and the families at their letterboxes is not simply a record of endurance or a catalogue of patience under pressure. What remains is something more fundamental and more human than either of those things. It is the record of millions of people discovering, inside the specific and demanding conditions of the war's waiting, something about themselves and about each other that the ordinary pace of peacetime life had never required them to find. They discovered what they were made of when the waiting stripped away the distractions and the certainties that had previously defined their days. They discovered who they could trust when the waiting forced them into a dependence on the people around them that ordinary independence had never required. They discovered what they valued most when the waiting removed the abundance that had previously made choosing unnecessary. They discovered the specific texture of their own courage, not the dramatic and instantaneous courage of the moment of action, but the quieter and in many ways more demanding courage of the long wait before it, sustained across days and months and years without the relief of resolution and without any guarantee that the resolution, when it eventually came, would be the one they had been hoping for. That courage was real, and it was human, and it deserves to be remembered as clearly and as honestly as anything the war produced. Waiting is the part of the story that nobody tells. The histories are full of actions, the battles, the decisions, the moments when everything changed. But the waiting that surrounded those moments, that preceded and followed them, that constituted the majority of most people's wartime experience, this tends to disappear from the record, because waiting produces no dramatic event and leaves no obvious trace. The diary entry that reads "Nothing happened today" is the truest document of what most days in the war were actually like. And it is also the one that historians find hardest to work with, because nothing happening is, by definition, not a story that moves forward. But the nothing that happened on those days was not, for the people living inside it, nothing. It was fear, managed. It was hope, sustained. It was love, maintained across distances and uncertainties that the ordinary conditions of peacetime life had never imposed. It was the daily, grinding, unglamorous discipline of being ready for something that had not yet arrived, of keeping the gun clean, the mind focused, the household functioning, the children fed, the faith intact, in the absence of any clear indication of when the readiness would be required or whether it would prove to have been adequate when the moment finally came. The waiting of the Second World War was one of the largest collective human experiences of the 20th century. The scale of it is almost impossible to fully grasp. Millions of people, across years, in every part of the world, suspended in the specific condition of not yet safe, not yet over, not yet home. The cumulative weight of all that suspended time, all that managed uncertainty, all that patient endurance directed toward outcomes that could not be guaranteed. This is something that the conventional historical account of the war does not begin to capture, and that only the personal accounts, the diaries, the letters, the testimonies of the people who lived inside it can begin to convey. What those personal accounts reveal, when you read them carefully, is that the waiting was not simply a passive experience, it was an active one, requiring constant management, constant adjustment, constant re-evaluation of what was known and what was uncertain and what could be done with the difference. The soldier who maintained his equipment during the quiet days was doing something real. The family that kept a household functioning through years of absence and uncertainty was doing something real. The prisoner who organized an education program behind wire was doing something real. All of it was directed ultimately toward the same thing, the management of the gap between where they were and where they needed to be, between what they had and what they needed, between the present they were in and the future they were trying to reach. The people who endured the war's waiting were not passive victims of a historical process that was happening to them. They were agents, working within severe constraints, making the best choices available to them with the resources they had, and sustaining across years of uncertainty the specific human qualities, patience, hope, courage, care, ingenuity that the waiting required. Their contribution to the war's outcome was real, even where it was invisible. There is something in this that speaks beyond the specific context of the war, something about the relationship between waiting and living that the war's extreme conditions made temporarily visible, and that the return of peacetime comfort has allowed to recede again into the background of ordinary experience. We wait, all of us in one way or another, for things we cannot control and cannot fully predict, and the wisdom that the wartime generation developed in the management of their waiting, the patience, the practical focus on what could be controlled, the maintenance of human connection across distance and uncertainty, the stubborn daily renewal of hope, is wisdom that belongs to all of us, available whenever we have the stillness to hear it. Rest now, the waiting is over for tonight. Whatever you are carrying into this quiet hour, set it down gently beside you and let it be still. You are here and the night is calm, and the only thing required of you right now is simply to breathe and to be. That is enough. That has always been enough.